right, good morning and welcome to Counterpoints. How you doing, Emily?
I'm doing great. This is our last show together before Thanksgiving, so just know, Ryan, that I'm thankful for you and thankful for everybody who's watching.
Thankful for you too. Thankful for all of you, and don't burn your porch down. Deep frying your turkey.
We were just talking about this. Ryan and producer Griffin are obsessed with deep frying turkeys, apparently. But we also
do it outside and not on wood.
Yes. Yeah. Now, BreakingPoints.com is where you go for a premium subscription. But if you can't cover the premium subscription, not the best use of your money right now, you're spending all of it on turkey deep fryers, Ryan, what can you do?
Look, if you share our stuff, that is almost more valuable than a Breaking Points premium subscription. Like it, subscribe, and also, importantly, share it. Like, make sure that we're spreading this, because right now is the most important time to kind of get this in front of people, because the iron is hot. People are like, wait a minute, we've been lied to for so long. Right. And wait, what's going on with this Mika and Joe thing? What? I thought these were the resistance leaders.
Yes.
And now they're like angling for cabinet positions.
The time is ripe.
So the time is ripe. The mainstream media has discredited itself. I think if you've been watching this program over the last several years, you have been much better informed than any of your peers. So you can either keep that by keeping it a secret, and then you can be the smart one in your social group.
Which is one way to do it.
Which is one way to do it, or you can share this more generally. And also, in the comment section, it's always nice if people say when the news actually starts in the A block.
Yes, because often Ryan will monologue in the, no, kidding. Ryan does have a great monologue prepped for the end of the show that's going to be about why Democrats lost. I'm really excited for that. We're going to start with new Trump appointments. Also, late last night, naming an education secretary. We're going to walk through all of that. And actually on the point Ryan was...
They're even getting funnier almost.
There's a WWE connection. We'll get into that in just a moment. We'll be talking about Matt Gaetz, and to the point you were just making, Ryan, I mean, I think this has been covered very poorly by media. There's just a lot more context that makes the story, whether you love or hate Matt Gaetz, actually more interesting. So we'll be talking about Matt Gaetz today. We'll be talking about the second day of Morning Joe outrage. Why is it worth talking about? Because it's fascinating to see how the inner circle of the Joe and Mika world is reacting to them. We'll be talking about the ongoing trial of Laken Riley and the murder of Laken Riley, and we have a guest, Ryan, talking about Israel. Yeah,
Haviv Rettiger is a very high-profile journalist in Israel. I would describe him as kind of a bit to the right of Netanyahu. So we'll let him just plant himself on the spectrum, but that's, I don't think he would even consider that to be an insult. We're gonna talk to him at the back end of the show. A couple things. Maybe we'll get to talk to him about the joint resolution of disapproval. That's the technical name for a measure that is coming up in the Senate later today that would basically restrict some arms to Israel. It's a historic vote in the sense that the Senate never allows kind of floor votes on blocking weapons to Israel. There's a particular provision of law that allows any senator to get such a measure onto the floor. Bernie Sanders has gone through that very complicated process to make that happen. So that's going to happen later today. The advocates of it are hoping for maybe 20 votes max. Like, they're not expecting it to pass, but they think if they can get above 20, push closer to even 30, that at least it sends a shot. One other thing we won't get a chance to talk about, but since we won't be doing a show before then, November 24th, it's going to be a revolution in Pakistan. So it's going to get wild.
You heard it here first.
Imran Khan has called for massive nationwide protests, and particularly focused on Islamabad. I'm hearing that in Pakistan, the government now, military government, is basically barring buses from bringing people to Islamabad, shutting down gas stations, doing everything they can to try to prevent millions of people from descending on the capital. Well, they believe that Trump is more sympathetic, much more sympathetic than Biden to their democracy movement, which is interesting and probably also true.
Although then you have to talk about people like Tulsi Gabbard and others that'll be around Trump who might deal with these questions before they even get to Trump.
Well, yeah, but who knows? Who knows where she comes down on that question? It's going to be extremely interesting.
Yeah.
Rick Grinnell, who's very close advisor to Trump, has played footsie with the Imran Khan kind of movement.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
All right.
Like right before the election, he was like retweeting photos of himself with like Imran Khan or whatever. It was like
Really?
sending subtle signals. He wouldn't quite say anything positive, but he was sending very subtle signals that were picked up loud and clear. So Imran Khan is thinking like, this is my shot, that we're going to kick it off now, and we're going to stay in Islamabad until Trump is inaugurated and see what happens.
Well, if you care about this issue, you'll want to stay tuned to Ryan's coverage here on Breaking Points, because it is truly incredible.
It's coming to a climax, it looks like.
Fascinating. All right. Well, let's start with the A block and Trump's decision to nominate Howard Lutnick, who was, we can put this up, A1, who was under consideration, very seriously under consideration for Treasury Secretary. He's now being nominated for Commerce Secretary. He's the CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald. He had been pushed by Elon Musk as a disruptor for the Treasury Secretary job. Trump is apparently very nervous about the markets. This is some of the reporting is that if you nominate a disruptor for Treasury, it could affect the markets in ways that Donald Trump is very sensitive to how that reflects on the president. So he doesn't want to, reportedly, this is the theory, I think it's actually probably a pretty good one, Ryan. He doesn't necessarily want to spook the markets too much by putting a disruptor like people think Lutnick could be. I'm not sure how true it is that Lutnick would be a disruptor, to be honest, but he's at Commerce now. It's sort of a loss for him.
Yeah, I think Trump was spooked when some of his Gaetz-like and Gaetz appointments kind of spooked the market. And started creating a lot of volatility. There's this famous anecdote from when James Carville and Bill Clinton first took power in 1992. They came in with these, I'm not going to call them ambitious plans, but they came in with plans. And they were immediately confronted by their economic advisors saying, if you do X, Y, and Z, the bond market is going to respond this way. And when the bond market responds this way, that changes all your calculations over here in this way. You're actually already seeing 10-year treasuries falling and mortgage interest rates increasing because the market believes that Trump's policies of mass deportation and tariffs are going to be inflationary.
Right.
And so the bond market is already kicking Trump's rear end. So the famous anecdote is that Carville said when he died, he wanted to come back as the bond market because it's the most powerful institution in the world. It's still true. And so I think, and Trump intuitively understands interest rates because his entire real estate play for decades was just an interest rate and cash flow play. So he really has a feel for interest rates in a way that most politicians don't. And that's why I think he berated the Federal Reserve so effectively throughout his first term, the first president to really kind of break that wall between the supposed independence of the Fed, which is not independent, it's a political institution, and the elected leadership in the country. So yes, I think you're right that he's being dragged around by his tail by the bond market here.
Well, and Lutnick was the co-chair of the Trump transition, and he's been sort of stumping for Trump on CNBC and has for a while, which Trump is also reportedly not very impressed with CNBC. He's been watching the morning show over on CNBC, and Lutnick had some really viral moments, like giving this defense of Trump, or this, it was even like, you could call it offense, going on offense for the Trump position. And, you know, on tariffs and actually taking the full Trump economic agenda and trying to sort of put his Wall Street spin on it. One question I have for you, Ryan, is what does he bring from Cantor Fitzgerald in terms of like either baggage or advantages going into the commerce job?
Well, it's the pedigree, the credibility. Trump wants somebody who has, went to the right schools and worked at the right banks to signal to the markets that this person's not a crank. Well, he doesn't want the guy from like Birch Gold as his Treasury Secretary.
Mike Lindell for Treasury.
Mike Lindell as Commerce Secretary. Like that's not going to fly. And so it's not about baggage. Like I think he's looking for some type of credibility. And I think you can tell how upset he is about the fact that he had to name him Commerce Secretary by the fact that when he announced the pick, he said he will also oversee USTR, which is the trade representative. So he's like, okay, fine, I'm not getting my Treasury pick, bond market, you win, but my Commerce Secretary is going to run trade policy.
Right.
And the USTR, this is the trade representative, Robert Lighthizer, who will probably get that job.
But Trump is probably...
It's a cabinet level pick, and it doesn't really report to any agency, but what he's suggesting is Lutnick is going to be the direction of trade, not whatever neoliberal banker I'm forced to appoint.
This goes with
Treasury.
I think this goes with your theory, though. He's everyone expects this to be Robert Lighthizer. It seems like the most obvious appointment that Trump could make, and I wonder if he is slow walking it because he's trying to dish it out to the markets in a different clip to avoid any.
Although I think
massive...
I think the markets wouldn't freak out about Lighthizer, because he's the devil they know.
True.
And the devil they don't know, because they know that Lighthizer's not actually going to do 20% tariffs on everything.
How dare you?
That he's going to do much more targeted ones.
200% tariffs.
Yeah, and the way you do it, you do tariffs on everything, and then you waive it for Europe and Africa and Southeast Asia and India and South America, and by the end you're like, oh wait, this is just
Antarctica.
This is just China and Antarctica that are getting hit with this. There's also some talk that maybe Lighthizer gets a trade czar position, which kind of almost is over top of USTR. But I think the basic point is yes, this and Marco Rubio are one of the times he blinked. Now, maybe he comes in with some, radical Treasury Secretary nominee, but I wouldn't think so, because he was looking for somebody who had credentials and bought into a lot of Trump's economic policy. The Venn diagram of that is like one guy. Maybe if there are any more, I don't know them.
Well, speaking of whether Trump is blinking on some of these, let's put A2 up on the screen. He made another nomination later last night. After passing her over for Commerce, Tara Palmieri wrote, I'm hearing that Linda McMahon is the lead contender for Secretary of Education. She's co-chair of the transition with Lutnick, actually, and former head of small business admin during the first term. I'm hearing that by Friday, all of the major cabinet postings will be announced. Now, Trump made that official hours after Palmieri reported it. It was like 8 p.m., something like that. So Linda McMahon is not somebody who has been involved in the education world at all. People who work on conservative education policy, and it's a fairly big ecosystem, is not, they don't have any familiarity with Linda McMahon as an education reformer.
Yeah, she won, and I remember this, because she ran for Senate in 2009. It's hilarious. She spent $50 million of her and Vince's money.
Founders of WWE.
To run for Senate, and it was just an utterly insane campaign. And it was winnable because it was in the backlash period against Obama winning. A year later, Republicans, with Scott Brown, won a Senate race in Massachusetts. So it wasn't an unwinnable race in Connecticut. At the time, she had just been elected to the Board of Education in Connecticut. But that was like a make work kind of credential gig to put it on your resume so that you're not just Vince McMahon's wife running for Senate. You have something that you can point to. So basically, that's her experience. I think she's been on the board of some schools.
Yeah, she's like.
Most rich people have been on the board of schools.
Yeah, well,
you give money to the school and they put you on the board.
How could you show up at the annual ball without? Yeah,
it's
it would
hard
be
to
uncouth.
Not be on the board if you're giving the amount of money that they're giving to these schools. Yeah.
Right. So, but anyway, all that is to say, she was in the running for Commerce. So Trump gives Commerce to her co-chair in the transition, Lutnick, and then slots Linda McMahon into the education role. Betsy DeVos obviously was his education secretary last time around, and DeVos, who had a rocky confirmation actually, spent decades and decades deeply enmeshed in education policy in a way that frankly was terrifying to people who oppose school choice and voucher systems and all of that. And I'm sure—
we published a book about her called Schoolhouse Wreck.
I remember this. Yes, that's right. So if you're on the left, Betsy DeVos's decades of experience in education policy is actually like a huge threat. Linda McMahon, incoming, Donald Trump says we're going to send education back to the states. That was part of his statement nominating Linda McMahon last night. That should be much less terrifying to anybody who is opposed to conservative reforms to the Department of Education, because I don't understand how she'll have the appetite for pretty radical change, to be honest. So the appetite and the know-how for that, it doesn't seem like it's a deep, unabiding passion of hers, and it doesn't seem like, there'll be people at the Department of Education that are more from the DeVos camp, but
I'd say less terrifying from the left perspective than DeVos, but it seems like the play here is that this is a win for kind of the MAGA world, because she's a close ally of Trump. She's going to do what Trump asks. she's definitely not going to buck him with her own education ideas, which means that
Does she have education ideas? Though,
exactly,
seriously.
that's the point. Yeah,
Right.
and then the MAGA world that does have education ideas, let's say, and Chris Rufo, is he welcomed back into MAGA world after his support of
Yeah.
DeSantis?
Yeah.
He's back in.
Yeah, everyone's welcome back in, honestly.
unfortunate.
Except as long as you weren't like a Jeb person.
Okay. Yeah.
But even then.
Yes, it's big rainbow coalition come back together. So for people like Rufo, I feel like this is a victory because it's a kind of weak secretary who's going to then be able to be pressured to do particular things.
Or will be, because she doesn't have the like conviction to go along with a Rufo, will block it because it seems unpopular. I mean, I think that could definitely cut both ways. And I would imagine if you are a Rufo, and that's why I think this is an example of Trump blinking, because the one area of policy other than taxes that the conservative movement has a very robust ecosystem in is education policy. And there are a lot of very radical people in that space who have a lot of ideas, especially just germinating over the last half decade, have a lot of ideas about reform for the Department of Education and want to go like run wild, as Trump says he's going to let Bobby do at HHS, and would love to do that at education, and he went with Linda McMahon. So in a sense, yeah, maybe she's really malleable and maybe she can be pushed around a little bit, but also if you lack the like stomach for, when you have those activists showing up outside the Department of Education saying you're starving children in the inner cities, or you are, making kids worse off, and you succumb to the pressure rather than sort of digging your heels in and fighting, as some of these education people on the right would want you to do, then, and Betsy DeVos probably would have. She stuck to her guns on Title IX. She was a little delicate about it, but all that is to say, I don't know what Linda I genuinely just don't know.
It's not the culture warrior that the culture warriors would have wanted.
And there are a lot of culture warriors on education in the right.
Yeah, so actually maybe dodged a bullet. We'll see. Nobody knows how any of this is going to go.
It's true. Even Randy Weingarten put out a fairly anodyne statement about Linda McMahon and said, we look forward to learning more about Linda McMahon, instead of saying, like, this is just another example of Donald Trump.
They'll probably rush to confirm her.
We'll see.
Like, let's hurry up and because who knows what could be coming elsewhere. And so Trump has yet to name Baltimore real estate developer Stringer Bell as HUD secretary. He did name Dr. Oz to run the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. I stole that from somebody online. Be a hilarious pick. So yeah, Dr. Mehmet Oz to run Medicare. This is reporting from the 2022 race against John Fetterman, in which Dr. Oz is pushing for Medicare Advantage for all. And so this is actually a pretty layered and interesting debate here, as the lever points out, because Dr. Oz is so stinking filthy rich. He owns a bunch of United Health Group and CVS stock, and they make a lot of money from Medicare Advantage. Medicare Advantage is a privatized form of Medicare, which, if you're watching this and you're over 65, or you have parents who are over 65, there's a 50% plus chance that you're on Medicare Advantage. I think it's something about 52% of people on Medicare are actually getting Medicare Advantage now. And from the left posture on Medicare Advantage for many years was that it is just straight up bad. And one of my first investigative stories 15, 20 years ago was a dig into the way that insurance companies were using Medicare Advantage to rip off both Medicare and patients and doctors and everybody else, just to make profits for themselves. Under the Biden administration, there has been a crew of people running CMS that have really cracked down on a lot of that. And so it's not. I don't think it's as principled an argument as it was framed as before, because there are ways, and Florida has shown the way of ripping off regular Medicare in incredible ways. Setting up fake wheelchair companies and billing the federal government for $100 million and then shutting your post office box down, moving to the Caymans or whatever. The problem comes in with what the rules are, who's in charge, who has the power in that political economy, and if you actually are regulating it in a serious way, that having having private brokers involved isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. And for Dr. Oz to say he wants Medicare Advantage for all, that's fascinating. That's basically like a publicly funded private health insurance option, which compared to our current system would be a vast improvement. Now, it's
That's
not like
interesting you say that.
It's not like he's going to get it through. And it was his response to Fetterman being for single payer when that was more popular back in 2022.
So Medicare Advantage in practice is something that's criticized. Like you criticize Medicare Advantage in practice, but if we expand it to Medicare Advantage for all, because it creates a private-public option type dynamic, that would be better than the current system. Thus,
It would give more coverage to more people, and so
not that he'll really have control over this.
So Medicare Advantage is bad when it's run by scammers who go around to old people and say. So basically, the way Medicare Advantage runs is you say, all right, Medicare will pay you X amount, pay this company X amount, which is supposed to be equal to what Medicare is paying per individual, plus a little bit. And then you are going to do a better job for less money, because that's what the private sector says it can do. And so it's at its worst when people go around and say, we're going to give you vision, we're going to give you dental, we're going to give you hearing. And then when you sign up for it, you find that the actual coverage when it comes to those areas is skeletal at best. And it's just designed to like trick you into signing up for it. Now you're stuck, and it actually has narrow networks, and you're getting ripped off and you're getting worse care. The best version of Medicare Advantage is when a private company says, okay, we're going to take a health-first approach. And there are companies that are doing this, that are saying, it is in our financial interest, because we're getting, let's say, $20,000 to take care of this person's health care for the year. If we can get their health problems at the front end under control,
Right.
and then they go to the hospital less, they go to the doctor, they get sick less, they need fewer medications, then we save money. So therefore, we are going to invest in exercise, nutrition, preventive medicine, like making sure that it's easy to go to the doctor to get a checkup, like those things that then they argue save money in the long run. If that's the version of Medicare Advantage that prevails, who would argue against that? Because it's not that people want lots of medical care.
Yeah.
People would rather be healthy.
Nobody wants to go to the doctor.
Right.
Yeah.
You don't want your bills to be high.
Yeah.
And if you can align those incentives, that's interesting.
So
maybe when Dr. Oz sits down with the people who are at CMS now, and they show him what they're doing, he might be like, you guys are doing good work here. Let's keep those. Now, at the same time, he's going to push Medicare Advantage hard. That means by the end of Trump's term, I've seen estimates that have said 75% of people could be on Medicare Advantage, which is like you're basically fully privatized Medicare at that point, which is scary.
He doesn't, this rule, obviously you would need Congress to do anything really dramatic. So he can essentially go,
he can do a lot without Congress.
To overhaul the American healthcare system, he would need.
Oh, yes. He couldn't do Medicare Advantage for all.
But he could sort of tinker with the regulatory policies
significantly
in order to incentivize Medicare Advantage plans.
Yeah, there are small tweaks he can make that could juice signups, like just making it the default, putting it on the website, like pushing a little harder to seniors.
Subsidies probably to different directions.
Yeah, tweak the benefit of it. Yeah.
Interesting, very interesting.
But it's ripe for corruption, but also could make things better. Like, we shouldn't pretend that regular Medicare is perfect.
Yeah.
Don't kill me for that.
I was going to say.
But it's not.
Okay, Bernie. Yeah.
Bernie would agree. Bernie absolutely agrees with, not necessarily that Medicare Advantage is the answer, but that Medicare as it is needs serious supplementation.
Yeah.
That's why he's always arguing it needs to have dental, because Medicare doesn't currently cover dental, vision, and hearing.
Yeah, it's a serious, and
that's the way that Medicare Advantage creeps in.
Yeah, no, I mean, honest leftists like you and Bernie are pretty clear-eyed about the problems there. Speaking of problems, should we move on to America's sweetheart, Matt Gaetz? So the ongoing saga of Matt Gaetz's nomination to head up the Department of Justice keeps taking turns by the hour, it seems, because every reporter in Washington is now on the Matt Gaetz beat and is now working hard to get to the bottom of the ethics investigation in particular. So we can actually put B1 up on the screen. This is a report from the New York Times yesterday. This is Robert Draper, who said an unidentified hacker has gained access to a computer file shared in a secure link among lawyers whose clients have given damaging testimony related to Matt Gaetz. So that I had to read that sentence a few times just to be like, okay, who did what and how, because I found it to be somewhat confusing. But basically, someone seems to have hacked a link that lawyers representing women who have accusations against Matt Gaetz, someone hacked that secure link with all of the testimony from the witnesses. And the file of 24 exhibits, Draper continues, is said to include sworn testimony by a woman who said that she had sex with Mr. Gaetz in 2017 when she was 17, as well as corroborating testimony by a second woman who said that she witnessed the encounter. The information was downloaded by a person using the name Altom Beasley at 1:23 p.m., according to the person who is not authorized to speak publicly with the New York Times. So now Marjorie Taylor Greene weighs in with a tweet yesterday saying, for my Republican colleagues in the House and Senate, if we're going to release ethics reports and rip apart our own that Trump has appointed, then put it all out there for the American people to see. Yes, all the ethics reports and claims, including the one I filed, all your sexual harassment and assault claims that were secretly settled paying off victims with taxpayer money, the entire Jeffrey Epstein files, tapes, recordings, witness interviews, but not just those. There's more. Epstein wasn't/isn't the only asset. If we're going to dance, let's all dance in the sunlight. I will make sure we do.
When she's right, she's right.
So sort of openly threatening blackmail, and in a way that I think whatever Donald Trump and his allies are doing to senators, they are having some success so far, because we have a mashup here of Senator Mark Wayne Mullen of Oklahoma, who was the source of the claim. He publicly came out. He was like on the steps of the Capitol giving an interview to, I think it was CNN, saying that Matt Gaetz, and this was before Gaetz was nominated, was showing pictures of his nude exploits on the floor of the House of Representatives. Let's just roll this clip.
I think the president wants a hammer at the DOJ, and he sees Matt Gaetz as a hammer and all these other appointments. He's very confident in where they're at and can deliver the administration that he's wanting. His picks have been maybe unconventional, but we hired an unconventional president, and the American people wanted that. They don't want politics as usual. They want someone that's going to shake up Washington, D.C. You got to think about this guy. This is a guy that the media didn't give a time of day to after he was accused of sleeping with an underage girl. And there's a reason why no one in the conference came and defended him, because we had all seen the videos he was showing on the House floor that all of us had walked away of the girls that he had slept with. He'd brag about how he would crush ED medicine and chase it with an energy drink so he could go all night. This is obviously before he got married. And so when that accusation came out, no one defended him, and then no one on the media would give him a time of the day.
So there you had Mark Wayne Mullen after the Trump pressure campaign, and then before the Trump pressure campaign, when Matt Gaetz hadn't been nominated to head up the Department of Justice, just openly talking about what everyone who has worked with Matt Gaetz will tell you was common among Matt Gaetz, among the circles that Matt Gaetz was clearly running in, which were unsavory, to say the very least. This is sort of what's amusing about some of my friends who are supportive of Gaetz's nomination. They see him as a disruptor, saying, Joel Greenberg is an unsavory character. He's in prison. He's lied. It's like, well, he was arguably Matt Gaetz's best friend. Yeah. It doesn't speak well of Gaetz that Joel Greenberg is a bad person necessarily. Let's check in on Representative Anna Paulina Luna. We have a mashup to roll
love
here.
To hear from her.
Let's roll this.
The Republicans asking for this House ethics report to be released, it's people like Senator John Cornyn of Texas. It'd be hard to describe him as anything but aligned with MAGA. Are you suggesting that there's something in his stock portfolio that's questionable?
I'm suggesting that John Cornyn, to my knowledge, made statements that was actually anti-MAGA about President Trump, and same with the new elected Senate leader. But I will say that Thune has since changed his tune, and it seems like he's more aligned with MAGA and President Trump.
But,
so I will
when
say
they,
that
when they
it's
ask for
interesting
when
that
they ask
people
for the
don't
House
want
ethics
to have the
report,
light
do you
shine
think
on
that there's
that.
something corrupt about that? When they're asking for testimony, when they're asking for this report, again, a
I think-
bipartisan report, do you think there's something unethical about that?
I think that what's unethical about it is that this has been shut down, that they're not requesting reports on other people who are knowingly under investigation currently, and that I find it interesting that these actual allegations come out at peculiar timing while he's being nominated to be the Attorney General. To be clear, I do think Matt Gaetz is going to be an incredible Attorney General. I think this baseless smear campaign, frankly, is abhorrent that it's happening to someone like Matt Gaetz, who's done so much to fight the government corruption. And there's a reason why President Trump won not just the popular vote, but also the electorate vote. Frankly, people trust President Trump's judgment more than any news outlet out there.
Congressman, I just want to clarify something. You said you got direct, firsthand accounts from DOJ and the FBI when they declined to prosecute him criminally. Were you able to review the testimony yourself?
What I can tell you is they came out in a public statement and actually had dropped charges against Representative Matt Gaetz. That's what I mean by that. And frankly, what I'm finding is these baseless allegations, when people go out there and smear reputations, this happened to Justice Brett Kavanaugh.
So not true, of course, that the ethics report was just brought out, was just like sort of made public when Matt Gaetz was nominated. This was the Department of Justice investigation goes back years, and the ethics report obviously was set to be released a couple of days before Gaetz was actually named the nominee.
It seems pretty clear he resigned. There's no reason to resign the end of your term, other than to prevent the release of this. So it's actually kind of the reverse.
Yeah.
That it's not that these allegations are surfacing because he was nominated. His nomination and his subsequent resignation potentially buried them.
Well, if he doesn't get confirmed, he's resigned. So he's not in Congress.
It's hilarious. He's resigned from this term. He could get sworn back in.
He gets sworn back in
January.
because he was reelected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's the funniest resignation ever.
That is pretty funny.
It's like a 2-month resignation.
But if he gets sworn back in, then
that's
the
why it was
ethics,
so pointless and so obvious why he did it.
But then the ethics probe is back in play, assuming he doesn't get confirmed. Then the ethics probe of a sitting member of Congress is back in play.
Do they have to start it all over again? It'd be hilarious.
I don't think so, but I wonder, they've probably never had that specific dilemma before.
Yeah.
Ryan, though, there's a lot of other context to this, lest we fall into the sort of camp that most of the mainstream media is in, which is just reflexively treating this as though it's a cut and dry sexual misconduct situation. There is a lot more going on beneath the surface, especially with the Department of Justice. You're the one who suggested, actually, we take a look at this piece by my friend Molly Hemingway, my old boss at The Federalist. This is B5.
And let me explain why. I think the people watching this show are adults with their own kind of complex moral worldviews and are able to hold together multiple thoughts in their head.
Yes.
We'll find out.
the headline.
So let's talk about this, because this is, buckle up, this is wild.
And if you're listening, the headline is House probe into Matt Gaetz relies on witnesses DOJ found lacked credibility.
Right. All right, so go read the Molly Hemingway piece. Like, it's a good piece.
Very viral.
It's gone viral for good reason. It is sourced to public documents. Like, it's not the kind of thing where you have to take Molly Hemingway's word on anything here. The point that she's making here, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, is that the two women that were just referenced in that New York Times article are publicly, according to a jailhouse snitch, by the way, you got it.
Yeah.
Always be skeptical of jailhouse snitches who are telling you something, usually so that they can, get themselves out of whatever trouble they're in that got them in the jailhouse to begin with. However, it doesn't appear the reason I find this particular jailhouse snitch credible is because of the details that he has. He was in a cell with Joel Greenberg, and according to him, Greenberg told him that he had two young women who were willing to lie to back up Joel Greenberg, to support his claims against Gaetz.
Right.
So where would, now that like I said, you can be skeptical of a jailhouse snitch if you want. This is what the snitch has said. And therefore, we need to know more about these two sources that the New York Times is talking about. Are they the same ones that Greenberg allegedly said were willing to lie in order to back up Greenberg and harm Gaetz? Greenberg is serving 11 years for sex trafficking and all sorts of other scammy, scummy stuff.
He was like the tax collector of Seminole County.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to your
He pleaded
point,
guilty to underage sex trafficking, wire fraud, stalking, identity theft,
Yeah.
producing a fake ID card, and conspiring to defraud the U.S. government. Pleaded guilty.
just a despicable human being, and has previously concocted claims against political opponents for sleeping with minors. There was I believe it was a teacher who was running against him for tax collector.
Just smeared him.
I guess as a Democrat.
Yeah.
And he created this elaborate scheme where he created a fake email and emailed the school and made these fake claims about this teacher to try to destroy the person, not just the person's electoral chances against him, but the person's entire life. Because you get an allegation like that, the school, the community, everyone is going to take that immensely seriously because it's just being made up. What are the chances of that? Well, the chances are remote, but it turns out sometimes that happens.
And Greenberg actually apologized for this, so it's not like...
This is not in dispute. Like, we know for a fact that this is a card that this guy plays. Now, why I say we are treating our audience like adults here, able to hold complicated and contradictory thoughts in their mind, is that this guy was like Gaetz's best bud.
Yeah,
and they were at
truly.
parties with like high schoolers and college girls.
Yes.
Like, which is gross.
Yes. In their mid-30s.
In their mid-30s, like,
Yeah.
get a grip. But it's not a crime, and that's not what they're being accused of. So you can think that they're gross dudes, but
Right.
the question here is, did Gaetz do this crime?
Exactly.
The Justice Department, according to people that familiar with this matter, found the witnesses not to be credible and dropped the charges.
Right.
So they apparently found the jailhouse snitch to be credible.
And
this
this
is the
was-
Biden Justice Department.
Right. And this is part of a plea deal with Greenberg, by the way. They wanted to get Gaetz so badly that they struck this plea deal with Greenberg. So that could reflect on the credibility of everything that he's admitted to, of course. But he's still got a long prison sentence. And this is the Biden Justice Department that has been targeted by Matt Gaetz over and over. Like, Matt Gaetz is one of the harshest, most vehement critics of the Biden Justice Department, of the Justice Department in general. So if there's anybody that they would want to get and like do it quickly, it would have been Matt Gaetz. They tried, and they were leaking salacious stuff about this investigation all along the way, and ultimately couldn't get him. They couldn't get him. And there's a lot of where there's smoke, there's fire in this case. There are tons of Venmo transactions between Matt Gaetz and his two female accusers.
Right, there's a new one that's like $700 some.
It's up to 10,000.
The memo says like tuition reimbursement.
Yes, I have them right in front of me.
This is gross stuff. Like,
Yeah.
what the heck? Gaetz has said that people are mistaking his generosity to his ex-girlfriends
Yes,
for
yeah.
Paying for prostitution.
Yeah. No, I mean, you can literally look at the Venmo transactions. It's
Very
right
generous.
there.
Very
you can
generous.
see it. And again, this is a guy, at best, he's in his mid-30s, and he's hanging around, flying these girls around the country and paying them on Venmo. One of them reportedly lied and said she was over 18 when she was 17. Either way, they're very young women. And, that's a different question than...
Yeah, and as Mark Caputo reported in Politico in this article in 2021 or 3, whenever it was, they went on this trip to the Bahamas, all these creeps, and the Customs and Border Patrol stopped the plane the private plane when it landed, because there were such young-looking women on the plane, and like they were like, "This is creepy. That's a bunch of old dudes and some very young women."
Yeah.
They turned out to be 18.
Yeah.
So it does show how low you have to stoop to make the case for Matt Gaetz, which is, Your Honor, they were 18. Like, that's pretty pitiful. On the other hand, the charge is that they were 17. And so far, the charges don't look like they're sticking.
Yeah.
And you'll wind up with these situations like Sunny Hostin got herself into yesterday at The View. I don't think we have that clip handy, but I don't know if you saw this. She was forced to do like a legal read. Because if you say with certainty that these things happened,
Yep.
you're not on very firm legal ground. So she was forced to do on The View a legal read where she looked at the camera and said Matt Gaetz denies blah blah blah, and the Justice Department dropped the claims, and kind of embarrassing
That is
to have to
embarrassing.
do. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so this is also a really impossible story to follow because the details are just, it's
most Florida
layers
thing
and
ever.
layers and layers. Yeah, and one of the
Most
women...
panhandle thing possible.
Very panhandle. One of the women, the one who I referenced lying about her age, that was reportedly to Greenberg, just to clarify. But all of this gets back to whether or not Matt Gaetz had sex with a 17-year-old when he was in his mid-30s.
And this 17-year-old, this is something that Greenberg was like trafficking.
Yeah.
Like to his friends and stuff.
And that's what it gets to,
Yeah.
right? So there's that question. There's also just ample evidence that Matt Gaetz, if you are hardcore MAGA, is not the person that is going to successfully uproot the Department of Justice compared to what somebody like Jim Jordan could do, or somebody who comes in without the sleazy baggage. In this case, I don't think it's necessary to pluck like the sleaziest person out of Congress because he's one of the most ardent opponents of a department that desperately needs ardent opponents. Like, he's not the only person. He wasn't the only option. I think he was an option, though, to make a point that we are going to, as Trump says, we are going to go wild. Like, we are going to dismantle this department. We are absolutely deadly serious about it. And that's why Trump is doubling down. He said, he was asked yesterday if he would reconsider Gaetz, and he said no. Lee Fong makes an interesting point on X. He said, before he was appointed AG in 2009, Eric Holder helped Purdue Pharma negotiate a sweetheart West Virginia settlement as the firm was flooding Appalachia with dangerous opioids, made a career of helping large corporations dodge accountability for fraud. Yet that was never a major scandal. And so there's this meta conversation as well about how all of our politicians are extremely sleazy, and the media and political establishment has a double standard. To your point, Ryan, all of that stuff can be true. Matt Gaetz can be excellent on Lena Khan and antitrust and be excellent on surveillance and all of those seriously very important topics that nobody in the political establishment, they might pay lip service to it once in a while, or they might not, but they are not serious about actually creating change. Matt Gaetz seems to be. He's one of the boldest proponents of antitrust reform on the right. He has actually put his money where his mouth is. He has stuck with it and been consistent, not waffled like the people we had Ted Cruz on. He has, break up big tech in his book. He cannot stand Lena Khan. Right. This is like, this is rare. And there's something about Matt Gaetz being at the Department of Justice that would be somewhat satisfying from a policy perspective. But it's easy to get caught, I think, in the meta conversation and not just sort of the simple, if we're draining the swamp, what's Matt Gaetz
and maybe you're right to the point that the left's best hope might be that he's just not equipped experientially to run an organization of this size in the way that he wants.
Right, yeah.
I mean, and when I mean the left, I mean people concerned about what he's going to do when it comes to weaponizing the Justice Department in defense of Trump's worst instincts. The left would be happy if he actually succeeded in pushing forward surveillance reform, antitrust stuff, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So no, I mean, there's obviously, I think he was targeted for political reasons. I think he's continuing to be targeted for political reasons. I think the media has a total double standard when it comes to Matt Gaetz. I think we do have a whole lot of awful politicians. I'm not sure that from a conservative perspective that practically or morally justifies Matt Gaetz. I just disagree with that argument, but hey.
Yeah, and just because it seems like the claim that he slept with a 17-year-old is not well-founded doesn't mean you have to like the guy and think that he's a morally upstanding figure. It
also, to me, seems like he's so ripe for blackmail. When you're leading a department like this, part of the reason...
How do you blackmail guys where everything's already out?
That's true, but I don't know that everything is already out.
That's true, good Lord.
He brought Chuck Johnson to the State of the Union, known Fed, Chuck Johnson to the State of the Union one year. And
there's a lawsuit against him for not being a Fed from some AI Silicon Valley antagonist of his.
Huh?
That he's falsely claiming to be a Fed.
He's falsely claiming to be a Fed?
That's according to this lawsuit.
Incredible stuff.
Yeah.
So Matt Gaetz
Peter Thiel as a Fed, and Peter Thiel then acknowledged that he had been doing that.
Matt Gaetz is entangled in a very interesting web of personalities. And anyway, I hope that people leave this segment more well-informed than anyone leaving the segments done by our next subject here, which would be Morning Joe.
There you go.
All right, well, let's pivot to Morning Joe, hard pivot to Morning Joe. We have to roll this clip of them every day now. It's sort of like reality television, which is always what Morning Joe actually, I think, has some of the best production quality in television. Like, it's so casual. They understand why people watch TV, even if the content is terrible. The production is generally kind of compelling at Morning Joe because it's like reality television. And that's what we are seeing play out on the show this week, as they are just absolutely playing up the attention they've received for kissing the ring at Mar-a-Lago.
Or the attention they're not getting, too,
yes,
from their viewers.
It's a little bit of both. So let's roll this clip from yesterday's edition of Morning Joe.
Yesterday, I saw for the first time what a massive disconnect there was between social media and the real world, because we were flooded with phone calls from people all day, literally around the world. Very positive, very supportive, going, I understand what you do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But once in a while, I would get a text or a call from someone and go, oh man, I hope you're doing okay. And I'd call him back and I go, well, Eddie Glaude was one of them. I go, Eddie, are you on Twitter? And he goes, I am. I go, okay, well, I'm not. So we've had a good day. Mika just had a wonderful event, and it's fantastic.
They're just like leaning into each other like a teepee.
Our desk is too far apart. Can't quite.
And we don't have any Starbucks like that. They always have Starbucks.
Well, yeah, they're sponsored there.
We have Sagar's weird African coffee.
Yeah, but we also got our own faces on
That's
these
true.
mugs.
We have our own faces.
Which you should go buy in the mug store that we got over there.
Buy the mugs.
So
that was the point of the segment, was to sell mugs.
And so, yeah, obviously this comes after they went down to Mar-a-Lago, kissed the ring. Their audience recoiled because their audience has been told for the last 8 years that this is Hitler reincarnated.
By them.
Yeah, by them. Told by them. And so now they're saying, well, we better go ahead and kind of kiss and make up, and hey, he won, so we should all be friends. And that just doesn't clash. Like, if those two things just do not work together. And so their audience is absolutely livid. Their friends who have their cell phone numbers think it's cool. And so from Mika and Joe's perspective, that shows that Twitter is not real life.
Which, by the way, it's the year of our Lord 2024. They're just coming to this realization. They cover politics every single day.
In this case, I think they're wrong. I think the people in their cell phones are not real life.
Yes.
Twitter is actually much closer to real life in this sense than the fact that all of their friends around the country are like, yeah, sure. This is working for you.
Right.
Let's roll. Well, not roll, but put up C2 here. This is an interesting kind of way that they're responding to this. Our friend of the show, Aaron Rupar, who has some irrational hatred of me that I've never quite figured out.
Of you? I didn't know that.
It's quite bizarre.
Many such cases.
Many such cases. So he writes, Morning Joe has turned off replies to tweets and hasn't been posting clips of the show. The trip to Mar-a-Lago not going well.
This is peak Rupar. He noticed before anyone that Morning Joe wasn't posting clips.
Yeah. I agree with Rupar here. This is a fair observation.
Yeah.
If you're a show that is afraid to be seen, that doesn't bode well, because your job as a show is to be seen.
Yeah. So let's put the next element up on the screen, just continuing on with this theme. This is also resistance. Ron Filipkowski. If Trump has them that intimidated that they need to retire, an MSNBC host piled on CNN earlier this year, but their code of silence on this is gross. Have some courage and integrity. Is that too much to ask, or are you just too comfortable? He was responding to this George Conway tweet you see on your screen, where Brian Stelter reported that according to two sources with direct knowledge, Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski were credibly concerned that they could face governmental and legal harassment from the incoming Trump administration. George Conway quote tweets that. This Twitter drama is positively middle school-esque, and says, sadly, Brian's reporting is correct. Over the past week, I heard from two entirely separate, very reliable sources with some vivid detail that they are absolutely terrified of Trump. Entirely separate, very reliable sources. I wonder if those sources were Joe and Mika, or if there were people like Joe and Mika who are absolutely terrified of Trump. But George Conway, who goes on MSNBC, would be in a position to know what the mindset is of people in that orbit, saying basically Joe and Mika went down to Mar-a-Lago because they don't want to face backlash, legal backlash, potentially from a Trump administration. Now, Ron Filipkowski and Jen Rubin, another person who goes on MSNBC, have been apoplectic about this, about Joe and Mika going to kiss the ring. And indeed, it appears that the audience, to the point you made, is as well. So let's put C4 up on the screen. This is a report from the Daily Beast. The ratings are falling. So the headline is Morning Joe ratings fall after Trump meeting announcement. Nielsen data showed a drop in viewers after the 6 a.m. hour. So,
and what's fascinating about that is that the show goes from 6 to 10, God bless them. And obviously, because most of the country still asleep at 6 a.m., the audience for the program
builds
throughout the day.
Yeah.
And then falls kind of toward after people have things to do. But what the Mediaite records that they obtain show is that they go on and they say, hey, everybody, guess what? Cool news. We went down to Mar-a-Lago. Trump's okay. Their audience collapsed. 30% of those in the 25 to 54 demographic had stopped watching by the next hour.
That's significant.
Yeah, because normally
Absolutely.
you're going up. And now you're losing 38%.
And 38% is a lot.
Yeah, I'm not a math major, but that's a lot. And so clearly what happened was people were like, are you effing kidding me?
Right.
Click.
Right.
Not dealing with this.
Right.
Like if you want your kind of resistance content from the people who've been giving it to you for 8 years, and now all of a sudden they're telling you that actually, which, we're not going to beat up their audience, but throughout the 2016 campaign, it was quite obvious that Mika and Joe were like longtime friends of Donald Trump and loved the fact that he was running because it was incredible for their ratings. He was constantly calling in and flirting with them.
Literally, yes.
Literally flirting with them. And then he shocked them by winning, and then their relationship soured. And so here we are.
Right. And they say they did all of this because in their sanctimonious way, it was absolutely worth it, quote, absolutely worth it to get Donald Trump to come out and make a statement saying he supports a free and fair press. And that is essential. This is their argument, is that it was worth their time to go kiss the ring because they got him to say nice things about the press, and that's just absolutely essential, the work that they've done to support the media here.
And maybe you agree with everything that they're saying, but what is clear is that they're only saying it out of fear.
Right.
And because things have not gone their way. And to me, they should just then step down. Like if you are acting out of fear rather than out of your true, genuine impulses that you want to share with the audience, let somebody else do the gig.
Well, interestingly, Comcast officially announced that it plans to spin off NBC Universal cable channels into a separate publicly traded company.
That's official now?
Yeah, that broke. Crystal texted it this morning.
Oh boy.
Yeah. So I mean, that's an interesting.
Talk about what that means.
It means an interesting future ahead of MSNBC because the NBC News and MSNBC tension seems to be higher than it ever really has been in their history. By the way, the MS and NBC, do you know what it stands for?
Microsoft.
Microsoft NBC.
Yeah.
Microsoft NBC. It's sad that Microsoft didn't just buy MSNBC back because we would be in for the same Joe and Mika bullshit. Because that's the real problem with MSNBC is that they have spent years, like you said, they wanted it to be known they were very close to Donald Trump. They had access to power. They always thrived on that access to power. They broadcast from the middle of Manhattan in 30 Rock, and they want you to know that. They want it to be clear that they are talking to the movers and the shakers and that they're friends with them. And that's what you see when they're in their quarter zips drinking their Starbucks, is this is just friends chatting, and you never really get much like disruptive content, even when they frame sort of things like, oh, maybe this wokeness stuff has gone a little bit too far, as disruptive.
Right.
So now it's fascinating to see what will happen with MSNBC. Does it become just the network of people like who tune in for George Conway and Jen Rubin, and the niche partisan content, Nicole Wallace, whatever else, Jen Psaki? Is it going to become that network, or is it still going to try to be a news network? I mean, I think it's a pretty interesting question if you're the executives looking at the future.
Yeah, and basically you're just going for people over 45 and 50 at this point. Like the idea that you're going to get any new people under that age to start watching cable news, I think at this point most smart people recognize is a fantasy. So then it's like, well, okay, well, how many of those people are Democrats and independent-leaning Democrats, or Democratic-leaning independents? And can you convince cable companies to continue carrying you and paying you? Because that's, for people that don't understand, the way that cable companies make money is not mostly through the advertising. It's from your cable bill that you pay to the cable company. A piece of that goes to Fox or MSNBC or CNN, and the way that they maintain that is by maintaining their relevance. That people say, if I'm getting cable, I want these cable news channels. And you'll have fights where people will say, I don't want to have to pay for Fox, make Fox a la carte, or I don't want to have to pay for CNN or whatever.
Right.
But other people are like, I'm paying for basic cable, I want the news.
Right.
Like that, what else am I doing? What else do I want here? I can get the rest of it anywhere else. So as long as there's a minimum threshold number of people who want MSNBC as part of their cable package, and that is understood through surveys of their users and angry phone calls, then the cable companies will keep paying them these very lucrative amounts of money. Because think about how much money you pay every month for cable. If you still get cable, it's a lot.
Yeah.
And a huge chunk of that then goes back to these networks.
Well, and it's why there's this incentive to be nicheified. And so that's what Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski are really trying, they're popping right now in a very uncomfortable way, this audience, this niche audience that they've cultivated in a bubble, which is, listen, I don't think niche audiences are necessarily a bad thing. I think they're really dangerous in politics, but they're cool in like music, and they're cool in all kinds of like different cultural spheres. I think it's great that we have a media environment where, Shane Smith can come back and do his show for Vice, and like there's some type of audience for it. But, this is also really dangerous if it's creating political bubbles that people, for example, Tom Cotton publishes an op-ed in the New York Times, because the New York Times builds this not monoculture audience over the course of the Trump administration, but niche audience of resistance people. Because they publish this Tom Cotton op-ed, people cancel their subscriptions. Or Washington Post, same thing. People are canceling their subscriptions because the Post made a decision to go back to the pre-1976 standard of not endorsing a presidential candidate because they saw their business failing. It's actually a really fascinating and interesting decision that these executives have to make, is whether they want to reach the broadest audience possible or corner a niche. And you can do really well. Like Stephen Colbert, least funny, most partisan guy in late night over the course of the Trump administration. He was the top rated for most of the Trump administration because people tune in over and over again when a lot of people who don't work in politics, like they just want the comfort food. And if MSNBC was giving people comfort food, it wasn't really doing news, unless it was maybe some connection to NBC News, some of their reporters coming on, whatever. So as soon as you start dishing out vegetables, you're going to lose your audience, because that's not why they patronize your product anymore. And so that's a huge, huge conflict for them going forward. And they're at a fork in the road. They can decide to do news or do comfort food. So best of luck to them.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to our next block. This is the ongoing trial of the murder of Laken Riley, which is taking place down in Georgia. We can put the first element up on the screen. This is the write-up from the New York Post. You can see a picture of Laken Riley on the screen there. If you're watching it, Laken Riley was 22. And I'm just going to read a little bit from an ABC News report about the trial yesterday. The last moments before Laken Riley was killed while out on a run on the University of Georgia's campus were shown in court on Tuesday, on the third day of the trial involving the murder of the 22-year-old nursing student. The Augusta University student was found dead in a wooded area on the Athens campus on February 22nd. Jose Ibarra, 26, is accused of murdering Riley after prosecutors said she, quote, refused to be his rape victim. Ibarra, an undocumented migrant who was charged with malice murder and felony murder in connection with her death, which became a rallying cry for immigration reform for many conservatives, including President Donald Trump. So as this murder trial plays out, it is harrowing, and I've seen it actually covered by a lot of the sort of women-centric publications like People that cover true crime a lot, because American women are very interested in true crime. I'm not saying that in any sort of misogynistic way. That's literally statistically true, like there's polling on it. And that means it's sort of undermining the point that ABC just made in its article, that it became a rallying cry throughout the presidential election, the case study of Laken Riley. And I think, Ryan, it was actually one of the most important moments in the 2024 election in terms of like deciding people's minds changing on the Biden immigration policy, sort of put a face on it for a lot of people who were thinking about the Biden administration and Kamala Harris and deciding, you know, what they wanted to say. I think it makes people more comfortable with Donald Trump, for example, when there's a picture of a 22-year-old nursing student and the sort of horrible situation that she endured. And that's not trying to politicize, that's just trying to explain why I think it was powerful in the election.
I guess. You know, it's a horrific tragedy.
Yeah.
It always makes me uncomfortable when people, when a particular tragedy gets its attention because of who the assailant is, rather than, and because it fits a political agenda. Like, people who are born here in this country commit horrific murders, actually every day.
Yeah.
And
there's a lot of
their
research.
victims are no more, no less, you know, worthy of our attention, and so that part of it makes me uncomfortable. But of course, it's horrifying, and I think the thing that has, you know, helped to catapult it into the public's imagination is also the way that it happened.
Yeah.
Just going for a jog, and getting grabbed. It's the worst nightmare of people who are running, you know, early in the morning, as the sun is coming up.
Right.
That some murderer is going to jump out of the bushes, like, and it's out of that kind of storybook fear that fortunately is rare, but when it happens, it's going to get elevated, and then when it turns out that the person was here illegally, then it's going to be weaponized. And so, yeah, we'll get a verdict in the next couple days, probably.
Yeah, and that's the thing with this trial, is that it's really playing out like a pretty traditional true crime trial does these days, where you're hearing, I mean, you're seeing the mother's last text messages to Laken Riley, and just all of the sort of heart-wrenching details that come out in trials.
And his brother
like
is supposed to testify. He's been called.
And he won't. He's not testifying. Jose Ibarra is not testifying. So that his brother's supposed to testify.
And according to one of the witnesses, who was, and it was complicated, that he said that he basically acknowledged that his brother did it, and that if the woman said anything about it, he'd kill her too.
And he's supposed to. So part of this is that the prosecution, or I'm sorry, the defense seems to be pointing its finger subtly, as some people have said, at the brother. That's part of the defense, is suggesting that it wasn't Ibarra. So it's a very complicated trial. It's no surprise that it's getting as much attention as it is. Now, in the New York Post...
Right, because the quote from the brother was, "I'll kill you too," or something like that.
Yeah.
Which suggests that he's saying that he was the actual killer, not the brother.
Yeah. And he was getting some federal benefits, Ibarra was. That's why, I mean, we probably disagree on the implications of this, because I agree with you that there is a lot of evidence that people who come into the country illegally actually commit crimes at a lower rate. And while that might be true, I mean, there's competing research on it. The research that I've looked at, it seems to lean more heavily into the direction that it's a lower rate of crime committed. But there's partisans on both sides doing this research, so it's hard to actually get to the bottom of that. What I would say, though, is, you know, I think most Americans would look at, I have the CBP numbers up in front of me right now, fiscal year 24, 1,000 cases of people who were in the country illegally committing assault, battery, domestic violence, 2,800 cases of driving under the influence, 30 cases of homicide and manslaughter. You know, this is, compared to the rest of the country, obviously these are small numbers, but when it's...
And you need to know the denominator. How many people are here illegally? Is it Is it 12 million? Is it 20 million?
Right, which we literally don't know.
Right.
We genuinely don't have a clear number on that question. But if you are the family of Laken Riley and you're looking at an alleged Tren de Aragua member who was getting taxpayer-funded flights from Kennedy to Atlanta, JFK to Atlanta, and he's already in the country. It's not legally in the country. This is already a question. It probably will reflect on the immigration policy from your perspective. We have plenty of, to your point, we have plenty of murder in the country as it is. We have plenty of our own domestic problems to deal with as it is, and so that's the extent to which I think it reflects on that is like that question of fairness. So we probably disagree on that, but that's I think why the trial resonated with so many people in the election.
Yeah.
For sure. We have this clip of Chad Wolf, who was a Trump administration. He was DHS under Trump, wasn't he? I think he was like acting, or was he?
Yeah.
Yeah, he was acting secretary of DHS. I don't think he was ever formally confirmed. Here's how he reacted on Fox News for a taste of how we could see the Trump administration handle this down the road.
Well, it's beyond awful because any criminal act, particularly this one committed by an illegal alien, is one that's preventable. They shouldn't be here to begin with, and they were facilitated. This individual appears to be facilitated by the Biden administration's border security policies, right? He's from Venezuela. He gets in on a parole. He gets flown and transported to New York City. He's not happy there, right? So New York then moves him to Georgia. All of this could have been avoided if you actually have policies in place that deter this illegal immigration and folks that do claim asylum, do claim some type of protections under law. We don't simply release them into the country, right? You use Remain in Mexico, or you use other things that were put in place to hold these individuals and then allow them their time in court if they get to do that.
So, it'll be obviously a powerful talking point for the Trump administration in the months ahead as they decide, that question of mass deportations, which is we continue to hear from Trump administration officials or incoming Trump administration officials themselves is very much on the table. Now, mass deportation is not a technical, clinical term. We don't know what mass deportation would actually be. We were told that it would start with the quote unquote worst of the worst, the people who are here and already have rap sheets or have been, coming in and out and trafficking, whatever it is. Now, that's a very difficult thing to do in and of itself. So we don't know.
Yeah, what's going to happen if Trump empties out the jails and prisons, deports people who are here illegally, but were serving sentences. They then come back into the country, get around his magical wall, commit a crime. Are we going to get wall-to-wall coverage of that, you think?
I mean, it's a pretty, and will that then be held against the Trump administration? Right. Yeah, I mean. Because
this wouldn't have happened if the person had been left in prison.
Yeah, I mean, Republicans have held the Republican administration's feet to the fire over immigration. I mean, this was actually part of the problem with the Cornyn versus Thune versus Rick Scott conflict we talked about last week, is people were absolutely furious about how Cornyn and Thune had handled the immigration bill under Langford and McConnell last year. So maybe, but obviously it's always different when it comes to Donald Trump. Ryan, let's turn to the Middle East.
Joining us now is Times of Israel journalist Haviv Rettiger. Haviv, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And so the audience understands kind of where you are on the spectrum when it comes to Israeli politics. I had said at the top of the show that you were kind of a couple ticks to the right of Netanyahu, but correct me if I'm, where would you say that you are kind of politically, just so people have the proper context for evaluating?
I'm a journalist. I'm objective from Mars, obviously.
Same yes. Right here, yeah.
I am a big fan of some ideas on the left. I still think two-state solution is doable. I think, in fact, everything else that I've ever heard is less likely and less doable. And on a lot of social issues and cultural issues, I'm pretty liberal. Specifically on the question of Iran and on the question of Israeli capabilities and on the question of how this war has been handled, it is my view that the Biden administration's humanitarianism, constantly pressuring the Israelis to slow down, has hurt everybody. mostly Palestinian civilians, definitely the hostages in the dungeons in Gaza, and Israeli soldiers have died because for periods of 4 months or more, the Israeli army had to stop in Gaza because they couldn't go into Rafah, things like that. There is a way to prosecute this war, and to do it slowly is the worst possible way. Israel has escalation dominance vis-a-vis Iran, and the only way to avoid a destructive war in Lebanon, I argued 10 months ago, is to have an exchange with Iran. So where does that put me? I'm very hawkish in that sense, but I don't think I'm actually on the right.
All right, let's go with that.
No.
So we put up this first element the report over at Drop Site News, but there's been a lot of reporting in the Israeli press and elsewhere about the kind of rise of looting going on in Gaza at the hands of gangs. As we report over at Drop Site, the kind of Hamas-led security forces are now launching kind of a counterattack, ambushed a group of hijackers who are killing at least 20 of them, it appears. And so the argument that's being made and you've seen the reporting in Haaretz, I'm curious if Times of Israel has done some reporting on this as well, but the argument that Hamas is also making is that ever since Israel took over Rafah, looting within that area has dramatically increased, and that the IDF calls it the looting zone. The United Nations yesterday said that COGAT urged a last-minute shift in the route that these 109 aid trucks took, and it put them right into the sights of the hijackers. So there are a lot of suggestions, both in Israeli media and from Gazans, that there's some collaboration going on between Israel and these gangs. These well-organized gangs are now hijacking trucks. What's your understanding of what's going on there?
Well, there's so much to unpack there.
Yeah.
The United Nations lost something like 97 trucks. Mm-hmm. The United Nations, out of a convoy of, I believe, 109.
Yeah.
The United Nations cannot distribute aid in Gaza. There are 900 truckloads worth of aid sitting on the Gazan side of the Kerem Shalom crossing that they simply can't distribute. When the UN is asked by journalists why, what it would take for them to distribute, they say Israeli protection. And when they then say to them, well, why doesn't the Israeli army accompany the convoys? They then say, well, they can't accompany the convoys because that'll make the convoys a target of the other side. There is no force, no criminal gang, no clan, no family, these are all these terms used to describe a real social reality on the ground in Gaza. There is no force big enough to take 97 trucks out of the hands of the UN, except Hamas in the certain areas where the Israelis aren't operating. So the very idea that 97 of these trucks are lost, the UN says something about it, doesn't say who it is, doesn't say who it suspects it is, doesn't say if these items have shown up on the black market in Gaza, being sold by certain parties or other parties. It's all very, very strangely vague. And then there's this argument that, in fact, it's not Hamas. It can't be anyone but Hamas. Hamas is still sufficiently strong in Gaza to not allow anyone else to come in. The irony is that a few months back, I think probably 5 months ago, something like that, the Israeli army tried to build out a separate aid distribution system working with these clans, which are just an important social structure in Gazan society that also sometimes built out organized crime syndicates. And the two aid convoys that worked with the Israeli army publicly, this is known and this is something that nobody has hidden, were intercepted and massacred by Hamas forces. And so Israel hasn't actually trusted the clans to be capable of actually doing the distribution and holding their own in Gaza. There is no one in Gaza who could have taken those trucks except Hamas. Therefore, my conclusion, I have not heard evidence. I've seen a lot of this desperate speculation, hoping to avoid the very idea that Hamas might be the bad guys in any scenario. But I haven't actually seen any evidence that suggests that anyone else even remotely has the capability. And so falling back on these conspiracies of the Israelis would love the aid to get distributed in ways that totally bypass Hamas. It would get a lot of pressure off of them. And nobody quite knows how, because Hamas is sufficiently strong to continue disrupting the aid.
Emily has a question in a second. I'm just curious. Yasser Abu Shabab is the leader of the hijacking group that that Hamas claims to have sent its security forces to ambush and attack. He was killed in this attack. What's the theory for why the security forces launched this ambush of these hijackers if the hijackers were actually Hamas?
That there's some chance that they were piecing together some kind of an organization that was capable of working with the Israelis, or that they needed somebody to massacre to make this case.
So,
and it's more likely. It's more likely than that 97 trucks were taken by those 20 people. It's more likely than that there is a clan nobody's ever heard of before.
You just mentioned something interesting in your answer about how Hamas is still, I think you said, sufficiently strong. And I think that's a really important point. And I want to ask, I probably disagree with the argument, but is that part of, because I think there are some hawkish people who will say, Hamas has been basically vanquished and destroyed. And that seems to me a dishonest argument. There has been a lot of destruction, but Hamas has reconstituted itself in northern Gaza, for example, and is still there. It's still, in dealing with infrastructure and all of those, sort of a vacuum, obviously. So who else would fill it but Hamas? Is this part of your argument as to why the humanitarianism, as you put it, of the Biden administration is insufficient and has been cruel, as you put it earlier, to the people of the Palestinians, the people of Gaza, because it sort of drags the conflict out longer than otherwise it could have been?
Yeah, the best way I think to think about this is to distinguish the Lebanon situation from the Gaza situation. In Lebanon, Israel's supreme interest is at some point pretty soon to end it. And the reason is that it achieved a tremendous amount in Lebanon in terms of weakening Hezbollah, shattering Hezbollah, and at incredibly low cost. And as it sticks around and as it expands the war and as it maybe goes deeper and as Lebanon itself has no other, Israel will start paying higher cost and for much lower return. And so right now there is a real ceasefire negotiation process that the Israelis are interested in. Hezbollah took such a blow that Hezbollah is interested in. Hezbollah's patrons in Iran feel like they're on their back feet and they're interested in. So there's a real likelihood, and every one of the parties wants it, but they're trying to shape how it looks and how they define the story of it for a ceasefire. The problem that Israel has in Gaza, the security problem Israel has in Gaza, is very, very simple. There is no other rest of Gaza other than Hamas. In other words, in Lebanon, there's a lot of other factions and groups and political organizations and even kind of militias. And there's the Lebanese army, which has refused to engage the Israelis because they know Israel's at war with Hezbollah and not with Lebanon. All of that other rest of the polity that can step in to fill the vacuum doesn't exist in Gaza. There is only Hamas. And Israel adopted a doctrine kind of learned from Afghanistan. The American mistake in Afghanistan, part of the American mistake was something called the clear and hold doctrine, which is that they cleared, a valley, they took the valley, they cleared the valley, and then they held it with a Marine detachment or an Army detachment so that the Taliban couldn't regroup there. What that ended up creating was many, many thousands of targets for the guerrillas all over Afghanistan. It ended up being a major source of pain and a major obstacle to America achieving its goals in Afghanistan. So Israel has the opposite of that in Gaza. Hamas is buried underground in 500 kilometers of tunnels. It spent 17 years building, and it's the single biggest thing Palestinians have ever built. And Hamas bent Gaza's entire economy to building these tunnels. And in 13 months of war, not a single civilian has been documented being allowed into the tunnels for safety. And so Israel's goal is to get Hamas out of those tunnels, to engage them and to destroy them. How do you do that? You take an area with Hamas, and then you pull out, and Hamas comes back, and then you take that area again. And so literally everywhere in Gaza, you've seen 3, 4, 5 Israeli entries, and each time an Israeli pullout to kind of reverse the clear and hold problem. So right now what we're talking about is a Gaza in which Hamas has sections of its organization still underground, sections of its organization that come up and retake control. No one else who can fill that gap. There's no serious organization with guns and popular support of any kind, even in small areas of Gaza, that can fill the gap. There is only Hamas. I haven't described to you the solution. I've just described to you the problem that nobody has a solution for. Not Biden, not the left, not the right, not Netanyahu, not progressives in America. Nobody quite knows what takes over Gaza after Hamas. And let me just say one last sentence about that, because this is fundamental. If Hamas can't be removed from Gaza, nobody knows how to rebuild. Nobody knows how to push the ceasefire forward. You can't dump $100 billion on Gaza and actually have it rebuilt if Hamas is the one passing out the money. So Gaza is a huge problem, and Hamas is the name of that problem, and there's no perfect solution for it. What the Israelis are hoping for is a long degradation war. It's going to be 2 years, 3 years, and eventually Hamas will slowly be degraded enough that other solutions can come to play.
So the United States eventually said, you know what, why don't we just withdraw from Afghanistan? Hamas is saying that if Israel withdraw from Gaza, they will release the hostages. Why not take that deal?
Why not take the deal that you end the war and release the hostages?
Yeah.
Hamas has not ever said that, it said this, by the way, the week after October 7. I mean, it said it immediately. No war, we're fine, we're totally fine. Here's all your hostages back, but totally end to the war. There's simply 2 points. First of all, that's not true. Hamas has always added massive other stipulations having to do with the West Bank, having to do with prisoners, including prisoners who are mass murderers in Israeli prisons and by the thousands. There's never been a Hamas statement that it said, just let's end it. Just let's end the war. Go back to October 6th. Nothing happened.
Well, they've said they would accept the Biden.
Something.
They've said they would accept the framework that was put through by Netanyahu's war cabinet and then announced by Biden in July, right? Didn't they say they would accept that?
It's an interesting thing. First of all, that's a very temporary, tiny little deal that leaves most of the hostages still in Hamas's hands. That's first of all. Second of all, and that they have occasionally leaked to the. Secondly, we don't actually know. We know a lot of things the Qataris said they said. We know a lot of things the Egyptians claimed they might have said at some point, probably. We know all this stuff from sort of unsubstantiated leaks that actual officials won't confirm. There has never been, I'm a huge critic of Netanyahu. I think Netanyahu's fundamental strategy led to October 7, and I think he has led since October 7 fundamentally while politicking. He launched his political survival campaign on October 8th, and I feel betrayed by him as my prime minister. But there has never been a Hamas deal for him to say no to. On all the hostages. There's been a deal on 30 hostages in exchange for 42 days. If you pull out of the Philadelphia corridor, big complicated question, happy to get into it if that's interesting. But this idea that there's an end to the war and all the hostages come back, there has never from Hamas been a deal like that on the table. And even things that come even in the general ballpark of that have been Qatari statements that nobody has ever been able to confirm. When Hamas had a working, functioning leadership, namely Sinwar, it would have been entirely possible to produce that Hamas statement. It no longer has that. Is Mohammed Sinwar his brother, the guy in charge? Nobody quite knows. So there simply isn't such a deal on the table. And the idea that you would pull out and let Hamas come back in and just retake Gaza now, and by the way, have this war again in 3 years or 5 years, and never rebuild Gaza. I mean, truly, you can think the Israelis are monsters. It doesn't change the fundamental problem of Hamas. It really doesn't change it. So if you don't have a solution to how to install something after Hamas, or how to remove Hamas sufficiently or degrade it sufficiently to put something else in, it doesn't really matter what the Israelis do. There is no day after until that can happen.
It feels like the Israeli plan, and tell me if you think this is an accurate description of it, it feels like the Israeli plan at this point is these kind of ongoing, what you'd call occupation / intervention in different areas, go into particular areas, push the people out, leave there, people come back, go back in, combined with watching and maybe facilitating Gaza turn into, a warring faction of clans against clans and gangs against gangs, which then a divided Gaza then is less of a threat to Israel, and that you just live to fight another day endlessly, rather than kind of settle on a long-term solution of coexistence. Is that what you see actually happening? Put aside what people want, it just feels like that's where it's going.
Yeah, I mean, you phrase that in a way that suggests this is the Israeli plan. That might be kind of what everything defaults to, right, because nobody...
Right, because maybe we can make progress in thinking about it by setting aside what the, quote, plan is and just talking about what's actually going to happen.
What is actually happening is that when you remove Hamas, half of the Gazan population is under 18. And Hamas ran the schools for 17 years. the idea of removing Hamas from Gaza is a much deeper and more profound problem than the strict military problem, which Hamas built Gaza into a battlefield for a war in which it would be impossible to remove it, at a scale never before seen in the history of warfare. There's nothing like those tunnels. The Viet Cong built quite a few tunnels. I don't think it's 20% of what Hamas built in Gaza in a much smaller area. And so Hamas produced a situation in which getting it out requires essentially this kind of war. I don't mean to suggest that every single Israeli airstrike is legitimate. I'm just saying there isn't fundamentally a different kind of war if you actually want to remove Hamas from Gaza, and Hamas made sure of it. And then there's the deeper point, which is the educational, religious sort of narrative point. Hamas tells Gazans that they are not suffering for nothing. They are suffering because they are the vanguard of a great Islamic restoration after centuries of weakness, and the great war against the Jews is that fundamental war for the restoration of all Islam. To a lot of Gazans who hate Hamas, there's also a deep appreciation of that story of dignity. And so when you actually start to map out what it would mean to remove Hamas from Gaza, it turns out to be this immense military problem, an immense cultural problem, an immense religious problem, a problem that Jews can't do. Jews are not going to go into Gaza and talk to Gazans about their religion. But that's also fundamental to removing Hamas from Gaza. And so there has to be in Gaza a much larger sense of the scale of the problem and of the desperate need for the problem. If Hamas remains in Gaza, Gaza will remain destroyed no matter what Israel does. Truly, I mean, if the Israeli prime minister becomes the head of the most far-left progressive party in the Israeli Knesset, there is nothing you can do for Gaza as long as Hamas rules it. And so how does that day after look? What is the role of the Arab states? What is the role of the Muslim world? What is the role of building out a Gaza that's different? Lebanon has a much better future ahead of it, because even though it's been taken over by Hezbollah in the name of Iran, if Israel can sufficiently weaken Hezbollah, there is the rest of Lebanon that can come in and fill a gap. Who is that in Gaza? How do you build that in Gaza? And we're talking here about the best case scenario that everyone actually wants that. I hope everyone wants that. I hope it isn't just, in the West moralizing and in the Muslim world just hating Jews. I hope it's actually about Gaza, and we can put together some kind of an international coalition that frankly moves in and massively, seriously builds and de-radicalizes Gaza. And then there's a real powerful argument for the Israelis getting out as fast as possible. But until there's even that awareness, you're just asking the Israelis to hand Gaza back to Hamas. And that's just something that the Israeli public won't allow to happen, never mind the politicians.
Well, in Control Room, I'm about to queue up E3, which we can put up on the screen, and then E4. So Bernie Sanders and Ryan will probably have something to say about this as well, is pushing to block U.S. arms sales to Israel. There's going to be a vote in the Senate on that today, right, Ryan? That's what Bernie is queuing up today. And on that note, I want to turn to this clip of Tulsi Gabbard on CBN, Christian Broadcast Network, talking about some of the deeper ideological questions that we were just talking about here. Let's roll this clip. It's E4.
You mentioned American taxpayer dollars. Is there a difference between funding Israel and funding Ukraine? Like, how do you see that exactly? I'm just curious about that.
Yes, there is a very
Because
clear
radical
difference.
Islamic extremism is what Israel is on the front lines of every day.
There is a very real difference, and there will always be with every unique challenge that we face and that unique decision that must be made. Using those two examples, are we better off increasing and escalating tensions and waging this proxy war against Russia, of which Ukraine has never had any shot at winning, when you look at what's happening in the war between Israel and Hamas? And it is a war between Israel and Hamas, a radical Islamist terrorist group. This is just the latest front of this war that's been waged for a very long time between these radical Islamist terrorist groups that have been waging it militarily and ideologically. This is in our best interest, as well as all freedom-loving countries and civilization, to take on what is the greatest short and long-term threat to freedom. He's afraid of being called an Islamophobe, and it's the same reason why he is not taking seriously the need to defeat Hamas.
Tulsi Gabbard, obviously recently nominated to be Donald Trump's director of national intelligence, and the host asked her, Joe Biden just recently pausing weapons shipments to Israel. How do you see that? He's on the side of Hamas at this point, and obviously we're talking about this clip as Bernie Sanders is pushing to block U.S. arms sales to Israel. And so I guess my question is, with this perspective that there's a deep ideological root to what we see in Gaza and sort of Hamas filling this leadership vacuum, infrastructure vacuum over and over again, is the response to that further military action if I mean, I understand obviously why that's an option, but is that ultimately, is it continuously justified if the root problem is a deep ideological is a deep ideological conviction that is like worsened by the military action in some ways? That's obviously arguable, but how do you see that sort of dynamic between one and the other?
For the last 150 years, there's been a debate within Islam, and it's a big and profound and powerful debate that's shaped the Muslim world today, certainly the Sunni Arab world in which we are embedded. And it's a debate about Muslim weakness, the sources of Muslim weakness, and what we do about Muslim weakness. And out of that debate grow some, pietistic, peaceful movements and also jihadi movements. And out of that debate, you get the kind of ideological movements of Hamas. You also get in the Shia sphere this Iranian regime, this ideology that says that Islam has been weak for a long time. And this is something that really becomes a problem Muslim theologians talk about because of Western imperialism of the 19th century. But this ideology then says, well, if Islam is to wake up, the first obstacle it has to overcome in order to show that it is returning into history as a powerful agent in history, and therefore redeeming Islam, and therefore redeeming ultimately the world, is overcoming the Jews, is overcoming the smallest, weakest thing that ever pushed Islam back. The Iranian regime, this is my message to Bernie Sanders doesn't fit in a little quip, it doesn't fit in a soundbite. We don't need American missiles in Gaza. That's not the kind of war Gaza is. The American arsenal, the American help is about Iran. And if Bernie Sanders can't explain to us why Iran wants to destroy Israel in the first place, why does Iran care about Israel? Why is Iran spending a double-digit percentage of its GDP so far with sanctions, with wars, with the billions it doesn't have invested in all these proxies, especially Hezbollah, the jewel in its crown? Why is it trying to destroy Israel? It has no border with Israel, it has no interest in Israel. And the answer is, it takes these ideas of Islamic restorationism and as the Jews being the first thing Islam has to overcome, absolutely seriously. And if we don't take it seriously, we're going to be surprised when they carry out on October 7. By the way, we know because Hezbollah has announced and Hamas has talked about that Hezbollah was planning on October 7 that was much larger and are very angry at Sinwar for ruining the surprise, so to speak. So we face enemies who will come at us no matter what. And if America chooses to then disarm us, the war is still going to come. It's just going to be worse because we're not going to have precise weapons. We're going to have blunt weapons we can build ourselves. That's my message there. You have to have that understanding of what the enemy actually wants when you're planning that to face them down, to have that conflict.
I feel like the Clash of Civilizations stuff, though, is actually a cover for not talking about the conflict in simpler, just territory or nationalistic terms. You can go back to the decline of the Ottoman Empire, but it's much simpler to explain the rise of Hamas by pointing to a couple acute things. One being the inability of Arafat, who recognized Israel, and recognized the existence of the state of Israel, and was engaged in long negotiations. And Hamas argued, you're being played by Israel here. Israel does not have, through the Oslo Accords or any other way, any serious commitment to actually reaching a two-state solution. And what they would point to is that immediately after Oslo signed, more settlements are built, more settlements are built, more settlements are built. You have elements of the not including Netanyahu himself, saying that the existence of Hamas is extremely useful to the position of blocking a two-state solution. And so I don't think you need the ideological stuff and the Ottoman Empire talk when you can actually say, no, the idea here was that there's a faction within the Israeli political system that opposed the creation of a Palestinian state, and had the power to put obstacles in the way of the creation of that state, and is now, since the election, talking about simply annexing the West Bank, fully, and even talking further about southern Lebanon being northern Israel, and on and on. But so can't you consider this in a much more kind of a simple way than needing to go back to the Clash of Civilization stuff?
They're not mutually exclusive. I didn't talk about Clash of Civilizations. I talked about the single biggest theological discourse in the Muslim world in the last century and a half. I can give you specific names and specific theologians and,
sure,
and the organizations they founded that produced this and the politics they're born from. Hamas was founded in 1987. Hamas doesn't go back a century and a half, but it's born on the ideas of the Muslim Brotherhood, and it talks that way. If you go to its mosques, you will hear those speeches. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I'll tell you why what you call Clash of Civilizations, which is, it's such a Western discourse. That's not how Muslims think of it. It's not how Jews think of it. It's not how Middle Easterners think of it. But the reason that these religious ideas matter is that I'll give you an example. You were talking about the Palestinian argument, and it's not an argument made by Hamas. It's an argument made by Palestinian diaspora elites who are trying to explain away everything that Hamas has done for 30 years to Westerners. But the argument that Israel never intended for Oslo to ever actually work out for the Palestinians. Rabin is assassinated in 1995 by an Israeli Jew opposed to the peace process. And that actually puts the left was about to lose that election because people were really afraid that Yasser Arafat, this arch terrorist who had hijacked airplanes and launched terror attacks that massacred kids, was now going to take over the West Bank. And Rabin's assassination increased the left's standing in the polls, and they were set to win the next election. And the next election, because the assassination comes in 96, and Hamas launches a series of suicide bombings in Jerusalem in the week leading up to the election that tilt the election by the narrowest margin in the history of an Israeli election, I think 30,000 votes, to Netanyahu. That's Netanyahu's first victory as a function of Hamas terror attacks. Barak comes back, the Labor Party comes back. He's already talking about a Palestinian state. He's at Camp David with Bill Clinton. They're negotiating shared sovereignty on the Temple Mount. There's a 95% of the West Bank kind of Palestinian state. And that's when 140 suicide bombings over the next 3 years, the Second Intifada begin. And not only Hamas, also
there's definitely a real symbiosis between the kind of Palestinian right and the Israeli right. I want to suggest to you that
the Israelis are not angels in this story. There are different camps. They fight constantly. And by the way, we don't have the kind of winner-takes-all election system that you have. You're going to be a Republican for 4 years. Everything is going to be Republican unless Congress switches halfway through. In Israel, every government in the history of Israel, there's never been a majority party, has been a coalition. And therefore, the Israeli government always works at cross purposes because different ideological groups are, by the way, the Italian government, we're seeing this now if you're following Italian politics, the Polish government, and we will see this in these kinds of parliamentary systems. We had a government, the last government that Netanyahu ousted, actually had a left-wing minister of housing and a right-wing minister of housing and a left-wing minister of transportation, which means that the right-wing minister of housing was encouraging the building of more settlement homes, and the left-wing minister of transportation was refusing to pave roads to those settlement homes. The Israeli government is multiple forces operating in different directions. If the argument is if there's an Israeli right-winger in the room, then Israel doesn't mean it, then you're missing the fact that there was a culture war, the defining political civil war of the 90s, and even after the 90s. The withdrawal from Gaza was also part of this in 2005, was about getting out and creating space for the Palestinians and separating and not having an occupation anymore. And it failed miserably in rivers of blood. And it failed miserably in rivers of blood because of these religious ideas on the other side. So at some point, you're going to have to deal with these religious ideas from the other side. On October 7, again, let's imagine the Israelis are the worst people in the world. On October 7, Hamas didn't just massacre Israelis. It had built these tunnels for 17 years. And it had built them for one tactical purpose, so that anyone coming for Hamas has to cut through cities to do so. October 7 was 2 atrocities, not 1. And the larger one wasn't committed against Israel, it was committed against Gaza. And it was Hamas's literal strategy. And so if you don't address, why is Hamas willing to destroy Gaza? It's willing to destroy Gaza because it thinks that so much more is at stake, the redemption of Islam. Well, if you don't address that, if you don't deal with that, you're not going to fix the problem. You're not going to end the war.
Israeli commentators often say that the Western progressives don't take into account Palestinian agency. It's not, they don't give the Palestinians enough agency and judge them accordingly. But what about Israeli government agency? It's true that Hamas set up an enormous number of, a gigantic tunnel network, and that destroying the entire tunnel network could require destroying all of Gaza and tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of civilians along with it. But what about Israeli agency? They didn't have to do that, right?
Yeah, you're asking me, is this Israeli government or the last 8 Israeli governments massively at fault for thinking that you could hand money over to Hamas, watch it build those tunnel systems? We reported on those tunnel systems for 10 years. That was something you could just turn a blind eye to and sit around. Yeah, the Israeli crime, other than, if you're running a country and you make a terrible strategic mistake at that scale, as I was waiting to come on, I heard the commentary about the Iraq War and Trump talking about when you lead a country and you make a mistake at that scale, let's imagine it's in good faith. Let's imagine you believed what you were saying. You own it. You own that mistake. And this leadership owns that mistake. And that most Israelis will tell you to the face, and most Israelis still want it gone. And it doesn't cost me anything to give that to you. I scream it in Hebrew. But the fundamental mistake they made was not believing Hamas. And the great tragedy for Gaza is that the Israelis absolutely believe Hamas now. And so when Hamas says we're going to destroy all of you and there'll be more October 7th, which it still says, the Israelis believe it. And that is a disaster for Gaza and has to end, or Gaza can't be rebuilt.
One question I've been really curious of from the Israeli perspective, and I know you've got to run pretty soon. We can put up E6 here. This is just one example. A reporter who does work for us and some other publications last night, posted on Twitter just what was becoming his nightly routine. So he's saying that, like, in an apartment right next to him,
in Gaza.
Yeah, in Gaza, in Deir Bala, there's a baby that the mother, he hears the mother saying to the baby, "I'm going to get you food. I'm going to get you fed tomorrow, I promise." And by the end of the night, there's still no food. And I don't know if people can even hear this, but what he just took a little recording of what he hears constantly, and it's a baby who's just hungry and tired, but can't get fed, and can't get the sleep that the baby needs. And I'm curious from the Israeli perspective, how, like, does any of this penetrate? We're talking about 2 million human beings who are living through some of the most abject torture, imaginable, and people who have absolutely, nothing to do with October 7th. Is any of this breaking through at all?
Do Israelis know that the Palestinian civilians are suffering? Absolutely.
Do they know, and how do they think about that? And how do they think about their role in that?
Yeah, that's a critical question. Many things are true all at once. There is a very clear knowledge that there is tremendous civilian suffering. Absolutely crystal clear. That's not something anybody's confused about. There is an absolute belief among Israelis that the world's moral emotions about this are not fake so much as fundamentally driven by bigotry against us. And the reason we think that is that it's worse in Sudan right at this minute, and none of you know and none of you care. And that's something you hear from a majority of Israeli Jews, certainly, and also I think quite a few Israeli Arabs, though probably not a majority. There's a sense that some of the discourse around Palestinian suffering has simply been untrue. There's been too much talk of starvation when there hasn't been actual starvation. And that doesn't mean they're not suffering disastrously. Families are literally for 13 months now moving between tent encampments in order to avoid airstrikes. There are no summer camps. There's nothing for kids to do. There's no schools. This is suffering at a serious and dramatic scale. But the invention around it of some kind of systemic system of atrocities that is purposeful and is not true. And is meant to satisfy and to catalyze a kind of moral, religious feeling that simply has nothing to do with the reality and has a lot more to do with Israel than with the suffering of the civilians. Because again, it's not the whataboutism argument. It's the simple, it's the selective outrage argument. You can't only think that way and only about these things. So first of all, they are suffering. They're suffering disastrously. And so I want to say they're not suffering as much as you think, but I don't want that to mean they're suffering at 8. I'm just arguing they're not suffering at 13, which is just simply not happening. They're not dying en masse. There isn't mass starvation. There are major problems in some places, and those problems are a huge problem. I have been I needed to say that before saying I've been very critical of the Israeli government. I, by the way, think that there's such complicated, difficult, painful ways, but we could solve a lot of these problems. For example, if we have to move them out of harm's way, we can move them into Israeli territory. There's a great fear in the Arab world that if you push them out of Gaza, it's the next Nakba, it's the next displacement. So just push them into the Negev. And then, what are they arguing? That we're moving them into Israel and not to? There are solutions. There are Israeli Arabs who volunteered for the war effort after October 7. Hamas kidnapped and killed 50 Israeli Arabs. A Muslim girl, 18 years old, Aisha, we still don't know where she is and what's going on with her. There was a coming together of Jews and Arabs. And Arab Israelis are Palestinian. Their identity is this complicated intermingling of identities, but they include a layer that is absolutely Palestinian. And what if they ran some of that humanitarian aid on the Israeli side of a border for people displaced? And once you move them in, you can also check them and you can pull them out. And there are so many ways to solve it. This is a government that in many, many ways has been incompetent. I'll give you just a tiniest example. Soldiers, veterans of the war, after 150 days, they missed a school year, an entire college year they just missed because they were off fighting a war. They come back and discover that they have back debt on the tuition payments for their dorms, and something the government was supposed to pay for but never did. This is a government that has proven incompetent for Israeli civil society. 60,000 Israelis were fled the north, the bombardments of Hezbollah in the north over 13 months that shattered and destroyed cities. 12 kibbutzim and a third of 2 cities are literally demolished to the point where they have to be destroyed before being rebuilt. And this government hasn't properly followed these people and provided them education for their kids and social support. We are facing a government that a lot of what you're seeing in Gaza, a lot of the reasons they haven't filled in with easy solutions, I don't mean to excuse it. This doesn't excuse it. It's just a different kind of a crime, is incompetence, is just incapacity. So there are so many ways to deal with this better that I desperately wish Israel was dealing with it better. At the same time, I share the general Israeli view that I don't entirely trust the world's moral emotions, because give us a better way to fight this war. Give us an actual...
Last question, then I know you got to go. And speaking of that, I'm sure you saw these comments from the Jordanian foreign minister, where he said, look, create a Palestinian state, every single Arab nation will recognize Israel tomorrow, and we will coexist peacefully. Just create a Palestinian state. And so you're saying, give us a way to fight the war differently. It feels like Israel feels like its only way to survive is to fight forever. That it is in a dangerous neighborhood of people who want it gone, they're driven by bigotry.
Until the ideologies were good.
They want them gone. They want driven into the sea. And so they have to fight forever, despite countries like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, on and on, saying, create a Palestinian state. We're done with this. We want to move on with this. We will recognize Israel. But why this clinging to the belief that that war is the only path forward? And can war, sustainable, endless war, really be the basis for a safe and secure livelihood in a country that wants to be kind of Western? You want to have cafes and startups and clubs, and doing that under a constant war feels kind of unsustainable. I feel like we're on different sides of some of these divides, and that's producing very, very good questions. So thank you for that really fundamental question. I don't mean that sarcastically. I mean it absolutely seriously. The simple point on the West Bank, the Israeli political left hasn't won an election since
the Second Intifada, since 140 suicide bombings ended the Oslo peace process. And it hasn't really been able to tell Israelis a new story. And what you're asking, what the Jordanian foreign minister wishes, was that the Israeli public debate had another story. The Israelis currently believe that if we pull out of the West Bank, it'll go the way Gaza went. 5 years before pulling out of Gaza, we pulled out of South Lebanon after 18 years. That was basically our Afghanistan. We moved in to take care of terrorists, and then we ended up getting stuck for 18 years and bogged down and pulled out badly, and the bad guys took over when we left. That has turned into a disaster for us. Every single unilateral withdrawal turned into a disaster, and the attempt at a multilateral or bilateral peace ended in the Second Intifada with 140 suicide bombings. So the Israeli public, and I mean left-voting Israeli public that to this day wants a Palestinian state, genuinely believes that if we pull out of the West Bank for a Palestinian state, it'll end disastrously in rivers of blood, and we're going to have to retake it. The West Bank is the highlands that overlook all of our major cities. The West Bank shrinks us down to 9 miles wide in the middle. People hear about this place so much. I don't know if they understand just how tiny this little land in which Israelis and Palestinians live actually is. And so it feels existential, the question of pulling out of the West Bank. And again, to left-wingers who want a Palestinian state. To right-wingers, there's even more so. And so the question of just found a Palestinian state. In Gaza, sure, why not? It's easy. If there wasn't a Hamas there, it would have happened, and it would never have not happened. In the West Bank, it's a whole different question. I still think a two-state peace is possible. Ironically, if we do something that the Jordanian foreign minister mortally opposes and absolutely hates, which is a kind of confederation between that state of Palestine and Jordan. What if, 3/4 of the West Bank, the Israelis can't be in the valley 9 miles wide, so we push in 1/4 of the West Bank. That's roughly what's going on in the Golan Heights. Israel doesn't control the Golan. It controls about 1/3 of the Golan to push back in 1967 the Syrian artillery out of range of the towns in the valley that they were shelling freely throughout the 50s and 60s. So what if the Israelis push up the mountain range? They actually hold the high ground with the Palestinian state, but then 3/4 of the West Bank plus Gaza, all within a Jordanian confederation that leaves the Palestinian-Jordanian border wide open. They have an international border. The Jordanians are now the custodians of the holy site in Jerusalem that they actually care about, Al-Aqsa. Very little would have to change. Palestine wouldn't be this tiny little fractured state surrounded on all sides by this massively powerful Israel. As soon as you start seriously thinking about solutions, as soon as you solve the ideology problem that you don't want to deal with, and I understand why you don't want to deal with, it does sound like an Israeli escape hatch. Forget for a second the Israeli escape hatch. It might actually be the obstacle to everything. You might be able to yourself become prime minister of Israel. This will still stand in your way. And it will stand in your way if the Israelis are evil. This still stands in the way. And so if we can solve the fundamental ideological problem, it's unbelievably easy to imagine actual political solutions on the ground that solve everybody's security problems, policy problems. We spent 30 years trying to finagle trying to sort of wend our way through the technicalities of the policy problems, because that's how diplomats think. And we never figured out reconciliation, and we never figured out narratives that actually allow the other side to come in. You want to know the big problem of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? There are wonderful polls of Israelis and Palestinians. We're some of the best polled people in the world. And there was a poll about 6 weeks ago that polled both Israelis and Palestinians with an Israeli firm and a Palestinian firm. And they asked the same question: do you think the other side wants to exterminate us? And both sides responded 90% yes. I mean, literally, one side was 89, the other side was 92. Both sides think the other side simply wants to destroy them. That's the problem, and that's what makes solutions impossible. First has to come the reconciliation, then the political solutions are easy. As for fighting forever, look, we're speaking English. Every conversation in English about Israel is mediated through this sense that Jews are kind of like American Jews. We're not American Jews. I went to high school in Wisconsin. I apologize for the accent. I was born in Jerusalem.
Hey, we can bond over that.
Finally, Glendale, Wisconsin.
Oh, nice. All right.
We're not American Jews. We are not people who have discovered over the last 120 years the promise of liberalism coming true. We're the other half of the Jews. We're the actual survivors of the Holocaust. We're the actual survivors of 1,300 pogroms. We are the 250,000 Jews stuck in DP camps 3 years after liberation. America liberated Dachau and Buchenwald in 1945. There's still Jews living there that nobody will take in anywhere on earth, including the United States, in 1948. They only start emptying out in 48, in May 1948, and those DPs are a quarter of the IDF in the 48 war. We're the Jews who had nowhere else to go in the world. And we are the Jews for whom the experience of living on our sword. Your question to me is, can you fight forever? The UAE wants to not fight. That's wonderful. By the way, we've never fought with the UAE. There's never been a war. The Saudis, wonderful. I'm a big fan of peace and normalization with everybody. But that they want it, and therefore it's possible. Iran wants us destroyed. We are the Jews who came out of a history of the 20th century in which the moment we stopped dying was when we could fight for ourselves. To the Israeli experience, everybody's living grandparents come from Iraq and Tunisia and Poland and Germany and Yemen. We are the Jews for whom the privilege of fighting for ourselves, of being able to fight for ourselves, is what redemption feels like. And so it's a great question from a Western perspective. Can't we end the war? That's not an option open to us. No Jew can live in Iraq. No Jew can live in Yemen. We are surrounded by societies with an ideological commitment to our destruction. I wish we weren't, but if they say it out loud, then if it affects their policy, and if Yemen is at war with Israel, really because of Palestinian rights, everything you know about the Houthis and the terrible civil war in Yemen and the 85,000 children starved to death, you think it's about
reach a
their
ceasefire
rights?
in Gaza and see if the Houthis lift the blockade, right?
But it's about saving Hamas. It's not about Palestinian rights. It's about the ultimate destruction of Israel, and they'll be there at Hamas's side in the next war too. And so we are willing to fight because we don't have another option. If the other side gives us another option, I promise you, this incompetent government being what it is, and despite what you might hear, we'll take that other option.
Well, I do think that was clarifying, and I appreciate you coming on.
Yeah.
Havig Rettiger is
Thanks for having me.
prominent Israeli journalist over at the Times of Israel. Love to have you back. We didn't get to get into the kind of politics of Netanyahu and Shin Bet and all that. It's fascinating and kind of broiling Israel. We hope to talk
you'll
about.
like what I have to say about that a lot more, I promise.
We'll do it again.
We would. We'll get you back after Thanksgiving.
We'll
to
be a
talk
Good
about
Friday
that.
show, actually.
Yeah. Excellent.
Okay.
Good. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ryan, I'm really excited about this monologue that you've written. What have you got for us?
All right, so yesterday, Crystal talked about the way that revulsion at the ongoing slaughter in Gaza may have played a role in shaping how and whether people voted for Kamala Harris. As she described it, for many people, it is not exactly a straight line from "I oppose this genocide" to "I'm not voting for Kamala," but I think she's right in saying that it effectively colors the way you see the other arguments made on Kamala's behalf through a different prism. You need the moral high ground if you're going to run a campaign based around democracy and morality, and it's reasonable for people to conclude that killing tens of thousands of women and children means you've ceded a bit of that moral high ground. I think her point is a correct one, and you can actually take it even further, which I do in a new piece over at Dropsite News. I'll put a link in the description, and here's a reminder to sign up for our newsletter at dropsitenews.com. Now, in her monologue, which I'll also link down in the description, Crystal accurately noted that very few voters say they made their decisions based on foreign policy, something like 4% or so. But to many voters, the time, energy, and money that politicians spend on foreign wars stands in as a proxy for their lack of concern for people here at home. At the same time, the 4 years of the Biden administration saw a disconcerting outbreak of violence around the world. Trump himself is a mercurial and unpredictable figure, whereas Biden is even-keeled, at least in public. Yet Biden's 4 years were a bumpy ride of chaos, fueled significantly by the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East. Sharing the campaign stage down the stretch with Liz Cheney was a signal to voters that Democrats felt the cost of those wars was worth it, and that we'd get more of the same in a Harris administration. In the post-mortem so far, the Democratic Party's embrace of a more, quote, muscular foreign policy, as they like to call it, has almost entirely escaped notice. But it didn't escape the eye of voters. In mid-October, as Kamala Harris began to do interviews with friendly audiences, she visited the breakfast studio of radio host Charlemagne the God, where she took questions from callers. The first to come through was one of those questions that is often top of mind for voters, but dismissed in Washington as a naive misunderstanding of how the world truly works.
Go to the talkback feature.
My question for Kamala is, why are we, and I say we because my tax dollars is sending the money. Why are we sending money to other countries when we desperately need it in our own country for homeless, housing, resources, for whatever? That is my determining factor if I vote for Kamala or not.
That's one of the reasons the America First rhetoric resonates, because nobody in America would complain about where money was going if American citizens' everyday needs were being met. So what do you say to that?
We can do it all, and we do. So first of all, I maintain very strongly America should never pull ourselves away from our responsibility as a world leader.
So interestingly, this was all a callback to the debate in Washington the last time a Democratic president had pushed through a sweeping new social spending agenda, LBJ's Great Society, but coupled it with ramped up spending on the Vietnam War. At a press conference in the summer of 1965, one reporter told President Lyndon Johnson the day after a bombing of North Vietnam, quote, "Mr. President, from what you have outlined as your program for now, it would seem that you feel that we can have guns and butter for the foreseeable future. Do you have any idea right now, though, that down the road, a piece of the American people may have to face the problem of guns or butter?" LBJ said that the American people would be willing to bear the burden. He said, quote, "I have not the slightest doubt, but whatever it is necessary to face, the American people will face," he responded. Now, he was wrong, of course, and the runaway inflation produced by the war spending broke the back of the New Deal coalition, shattering organized labor and ushering in neoliberalism and the Reagan Revolution. But according to Harris, not only could the American people have both guns and butter, they already had it, and it's good. Democrats, as they hunt for the culprit that cost them the election, are getting some of it right. Dramatically expanding the social safety net at the beginning of Biden's term, letting people know that a better world actually is possible, and then letting it all lapse as prices stayed high, turned out to be a political handicap. Then, instead of attacking the price hikes as the rotten fruit of greedy CEOs with too much economic and political power, the White House shot down the entire notion of greedflation, which is since confirmed as a driving factor in those price increases. And instead, they outsourced the fight against inflation to a Republican Fed chair who jacked up rates and with it the cost of mortgages and rent. Also, even James Carville says that maybe Bernie Sanders had a point.
I think Senator Sanders has some of a point here, and that is there were things we could have run on harder that have effect. The minimum wage. It passes everywhere by 70%. I mean, I know that President Biden was for it and Harris was for it, but we need to put it front and center.
Democrats are also blaming wokeness, whether it's trans girls playing girls' sports or the word Latinx, or generally the rise of a more dogmatic approach to identity politics that became popular on the left over the past decade. Now, I don't think they're actually wrong to examine that dogmatism. And I wrote a widely read piece in 2022 on how the phenomenon was destroying progressive institutions while a culture of fear and silence reigned. But it misses a key factor. In order to fend off the rise of economic populism in the form of Bernie Sanders in 2016, it was those same party leaders themselves who turned to identity politics, portraying themselves as the true champions of progressive values and deriding Sanders as a single issue candidate, that issue being the economy. Here's Hillary Clinton going after Bernie Sanders.
Everything is about an economic theory, right? If we broke up the big banks tomorrow, and I will, if they deserve it, if they pose any systemic risk, I will. Would that end racism? No. Would that end sexism? No. Would that end discrimination against the LGBT community?
Now, suffice to say, we did not break up the big banks, and we did not end racism. Now, my book, The Squad, goes over this chapter in painful detail, so I won't belabor it here. But now that Democrats have lost again, it's the very same identity politics they are blaming. It's an impressive two-step. In 2016, cynical wokeness was wielded to fend off a challenge to corporate power. Now wokeness is being thrown overboard to save the Democratic Party elite from a deeper critique of their failure. But there's a more fundamental issue Democrats are ignoring, the one brought up by the first caller to Charlemagne. By continuing to think of American foreign policy and American domestic policy as distinct, the former the purview of experts in Washington, and the latter the concern of regular people. Rather than thinking of those things in tension, Democrats are missing the way that their shift into a more war-happy party is alienating them from voters and fueling the perception that they have no intention of addressing people's needs. It's apparently easy to forget that the working class drift away from Democrats that was underway in the 1980s and 1990s was reversed in 2008 by Barack Obama, who ran as an anti-war candidate against a party shredded by its spearheading of the disastrous invasion of Iraq. 8 years later, Trump bested Bush's brother and every other Republican contender this way.
On Monday, George W. Bush will campaign in South Carolina for his brother. As you've said tonight, and you've often said, the Iraq War and your opposition to it was a sign of your good judgment. In 2008, in an interview with Wolf Blitzer talking about President George W. Bush's conduct of the war, you said you were surprised that Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi didn't try to impeach him. You said, quote, which personally I think would have been a wonderful thing, close quote. When you were asked what you meant by that, you said, for the war. For the war. He lied. He got us into the war with lies. Do you still believe President Bush should have been impeached?
First of all, I have to say, as a businessman, I get along with everybody. I have business all over the world. I know so many of the people in the audience. And by the way, I'm a self-funder. I have my wife and I have my son. That's all I have. I don't have this. So let me just tell you, I get along with everybody, which is my obligation to my company, to myself, etc. Obviously, the war in Iraq was a big, fat mistake, all right? Now, you can take it any way you want, and it took Jeb Bush, if you remember at the beginning of his announcement, when he announced for president, took him 5 days. He went back. It was a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. Took him 5 days before his people told him what to say, and he ultimately said it was a mistake. The war in Iraq, we spent $2 trillion, thousands of lives. We don't even have it. Iran is taking over Iraq with the second largest oil reserves in the world. Obviously, it was a mistake. So George Bush made a mistake. We can make mistakes, but that one was a beauty.
And he also beat Hillary Clinton by portraying himself in the same way as having opposed Bush's war.
Mr. Trump, a lot of these are judgment questions. You had supported the war in Iraq before the invasion. What makes your judgment?
I did not support the war in Iraq.
2002.
That is a mainstream media nonsense put out by her.
Now, when liberals see America first, they read it as xenophobic and anti-immigrant. But Trump's supporters scan it as a promise not to waste money on wars and nation building while our own country crumbles. But the critique in that slogan, and expressed by that Charlemagne caller, makes an emotional link between issues that are treated as disparate and distinct by political operatives. The jarring price swings at the grocery store and at the pump, combined with the out-of-control wars and the surge of migrants at the border, combined to produce a visceral sense that our leaders in Washington were sacrificing the needs of regular people here in the United States. People's sense that the economy was being handled poorly by Biden was colored by the chaos overseas. And his rapt attention to Ukraine and Israel left little room for confidence that he cared what was going on back here. By pretending that the U.S. could do it all, but then only delivering on the foreign wars, Democrats set up ordinary people to view it as a zero-sum competition. When Harris says, quote, we can do it all and we do, she is offering a version of conventional wisdom in Washington, which loves to point out, whenever people raise complaints like this, that wars are paid for out of different accounts than schools, or that much of what we're sending to Ukraine is in the form of weapons, not cash, which means we then get to make new weapons and everybody gets even richer. But even if that's true, most people don't consider themselves inside the we that's benefiting from all that. We just see money going towards war and our bills getting harder to pay. Think about how the overseas conflicts and the chaotic economy interacted with each other over the last 4 years. Now, one of Biden's most courageous moves, in my opinion, as president, was going through with the withdrawal from Afghanistan in the face of fierce military and media opposition. It wound up costing him badly. 13 U.S. service members were killed amid the retreat, and the airwaves were filled with the images of Afghans fatally swarming American cargo planes. It was chaos, and Biden never recovered from that. Now, that chaos, which played on repeat, hit just as prices were rising and the COVID-19 pandemic was easing. People were tentatively emerging from lockdown, and crime surged, which in many people's minds merged and was merged with and was blamed on the George Floyd protests from the year before, many of which had turned into riots. Now, kids who'd spent more than a year out of school never recovered. Then in February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Biden assiduously resisted a negotiated end to the conflict. In June, the conservative justices on the Supreme Court undid generations of precedent and overturned Roe v. Wade. The war in Ukraine raged on as the body count piled up and the U.S. shoveled ever greater sums of money into the trenches. Wheat and energy prices fluctuated wildly. Prices eventually began rising at a slightly lower rate, but they rose nevertheless, and the response of the Fed to continuously raise interest rates and keep them high arguably contributed to the problem, raising the price of mortgages and rent. The migration surge at the border became too great to ignore. That, too, had a foreign policy link. U.S. foreign policy in general has produced an unstable hemisphere with heavy out-migration flows to the United States. During his time in office, Biden tightened sanctions and penalties on Cuba and Venezuela and intervened to fuel chaos in Haiti. The three countries combined sent the bulk of migrants at key moments. Then came October 7th and the horrifying images it produced. Weeks of a relentless and indiscriminate Israeli response turned into months. Biden and his administration took a public posture that the U.S. wanted a ceasefire, yet the attack only ratcheted up. As the death count reached shocking numbers and U.S. weapons and financing went up with it, Biden's stated goal was to contain the conflict, unquote. But it periodically broke out into regional war. Shipping was effectively halted, and in October, Netanyahu, with the aim of defeating Biden, launched assaults on Lebanon and Iran, which launched their own assaults in retaliation. And the Ukraine war, with its ever-present threat of nuclear catastrophe, grinds on. Does that sound like we can do it all? So I think if, Emily, as you think back over the last 4 years, you can imagine why, when confronted with Trump versus the status quo, people are like, well, what I liked about Trump was that wages were going up, prices were pretty flat, and we didn't have a whole bunch of wars going on. Mm-hmm. What I didn't like about Trump was that he's an unpredictable madman, right. Kind of a lunatic personally. But if your alternative is all of these wars breaking out around the world and no certainty about prices and the economy here at home. Immigration, then you're like, you know what, I'll take that. Right. In hindsight. So I think the good news for Democrats is that if they want to make a comeback, just stop doing all the wars. That's a big step in the right direction.
And I mean, even just changing, like I hope they don't do this because I think it's cynical, but it's so telling that they don't even frame the wars in a way that is a pitch to the American people outside of Washington and New York. I think Joe Rogan recently was replaying this clip of Tucker Carlson confronting Mike Pence when Pence was running for president in the primary about how he sees all of this decay in America and wants to keep sending weapons and resources to Ukraine that could be spent on Americans. And Pence says almost exactly what you said at the last part there. Of course, the opposite. He says, we can do it both. Anyone who tells you we can't do it both, we can't be the policeman of the world and take care of our own people, has a very small-minded vision of the United States. But it's not a small-minded vision of the United States. It's exactly what's happening. And Democrats are incapable of responding to what Trump taps into, which is telling people exactly that, saying we are not doing it both right now. We cannot have it all right now until we start cracking down on this adventurism abroad and until we start treating immigration like it does have economic implications for people. We can debate what they are, but Democrats don't even talk about it. Don't even talk about it in economic framing unless it's to say it's making us all better.
All right, well, that'll do it for us today.
That was so interesting.
Enjoy your Thanksgiving. Oh, thank you. I'm glad you liked it.
And you'll be in Vermont for Thanksgiving?
I think we're going to go to Vermont for Thanksgiving. Yeah, maybe do a little skiing if it snows, hopefully.
Whoa, all right.
Yeah.
That'll be a lot of fun. I'll be back here with Crystal Saugers, headed off to Japan on his honeymoon. So Crystal and I will be holding down the fort with girls shows tomorrow, Monday, and Tuesday.
Wonderful. All right. See you guys soon.